Chapter 501. The Journey to Zurich. In the years following the Great War, Bruno realized how much of a target he had painted on his back, and that of his family. While his enemies in more prestigious positions of power were largely deterred from making an attempt on their lives as a result of what the man had done to Belgrade in 1914. Insurgents, political radicals, and just lone wolf threats had far less to lose. And Bruno needed to make sure that he and his family were well protected during transit. He had long since fortified his home to a high level. But transportation was another matter, and had invested heavily into armored vehicles, such as limousines and trains, that provided his family military-grade protection while looking like civilian assets. His private train, for example, looked like one of the modern diesel-powered high-speed trains that were coming online across the German Reich and the Russian Empire, as the 1920s roared like a tidal wave. But its cars were rated at the equivalent of the Stanag 4+ rating, and perhaps even Stanag 5 in critical compartments like the sleeping quarters and command center. In the years since Bruno came to power as the Grand Prince of Tyrol, Germany and Russia had been working on joint infrastructure projects to begin developing their nations and cities for a new world. And the railways were one of these projects. Luckily for Bruno, Tyrol had been chosen as the testing area for many of these ideas, and this allowed his train to be fast, sleek, and capable of defending itself from potentially hostile attacks. Currently, Bruno sat within a rail car that was primarily designed as a family space, but was currently operating as his coffee lounge, as he sipped from a cup and read the latest paper from England. King George had managed to put out the majority of the fires that burned around what remained of his empire. The cost was great, and Bruno suspected the empire would collapse to a similar extent as it had post-1945 in his previous life within the next decade, perhaps two. But there was no doubt about it. There would be no British Empire at this rate by 1939, merely the United Kingdom, and even then, it was a matter of time before the Irish rose in rebellion again. As Bruno placed the paper down and looked over at the window to the right of where he sat in his extravagant booth, he heard a voice call out to him. "Your Royal Highness, are you done with the paper? Would you like me to clean it up for you?" Bruno looked over and saw a servant he did not recognize, likely employed permanently on the train as a maid, and he was quick to notice her accent. She was from France originally, and judging by her age, had been brought over by her parents in the wake of France's collapse following their defeat during the Great War in 1916. There were only a small number of refugees from France who had been permitted into Germany, and those who were had been vetted quite thoroughly, especially if they ended up working for Bruno. Because of this, Bruno spoke in French to the young woman, as permitted her to clean up his area. "By all means, go right ahead. Tell me, do you know where this train is headed?" The woman nodded her head. Having clearly been given permission to speak by the prince she served, she was quick to respond with a bit of a sheepish look. "Yes, Zurich." Bruno smiled and nodded his head as he confirmed this to be true. He had asked for two reasons: someone who was not supposed to be on this train and was trying to conceal themselves like an assassin likely wouldn't know the true destination of the train. The world knew Bruno would be meeting with Pétain in Geneva, but the reality was the conference was being held in secret within the Swiss city of Zurich. There was another reason Bruno asked this question, as it allowed for a follow-up to the one he really wanted to give voice to. "And do you know why I'm going to Zurich?" The young maid shook her head, prompting Bruno to speak once more as she did so. "I'm going to Zurich to negotiate an end to the bloodshed and hostilities in your home country. Unfortunately, I have been bound by treaty and forced to watch as France continues to bleed itself into extinction. But now that some legitimate form of stability has arisen, and a figurehead has claimed a sufficient degree of power to negotiate with on a stage that is acceptable to the world, I can finally make a move. It is unfortunate that France seems to wish to make Germany its enemy for a third time, but perhaps I can stop this reality before it manifests." The maid was stunned that Bruno was going to Zurich to try to end the hostilities in France, and not for some reason that would ultimately benefit the Reich, and because of this she couldn't help but tilt her head in curiosity. "Your Royal Highness, is that really the reason you are going to Zurich? Is there not something else which benefits the fatherland that you are after?" Bruno looked at the young woman with a pitiful gaze, so young, yet already so in tune with human nature. Usually only those who endured immense hardships early on could grasp such a thing. And because of this, Bruno nodding his head in approval before revealing the real reason behind his visit. Wise. Far more than I thought you would be at your age. You remind me of my daughter in that regard, but more cynical. Not that as a fault at all. All right, I'm in a good mood. I'll tell you the truth. The way this benefits the Reich is that we no longer have to worry about a border being shared with an unstable neighbor. Nor will we have to watch in horror as our neighbors kill one another without us being able to stop it. Is that not enough of a benefit for the Reich in order to compel me to act in self-interest? Chapter 502, Whimsical Negotiations. Pétain sat across from Bruno in an undisclosed location within the Swiss city of Zurich. The two of them could not be any more different. Pétain was aging and dressed superfluously, as if he were the embodiment of 19th-century French martial excellence. He was prideful, boastful, arrogant even. One could tell by the haughty curl of his lips and the heavily maxed mustache that perched above it. Bruno, however, arrived in a civilian three-piece suit. He was not here as a man of war, but as a diplomat of the Reich. Though he was 40 years old, he looked a decade younger, yet there were 2 lifetimes' worth of wisdom in his azure blue eyes, and nothing but humility to match. Pétain immediately broke out into the discussion, making his intentions clear. Frankly speaking, the only reason I agreed to meet with you is because you're the bastard who seized Paris and made my life the living hell it's become. Bruno smirked when he heard this, before responding to Pétain's praise with a lackadaisical response. Technically speaking, my good friend Generaloberst Heinrich Graf von Koch was the one who led the 8th Army and its surrounding of Paris. Rather, I arrived just in time to negotiate its surrender. Pétain gazed in Bruno with utter contempt. Everyone knew that Bruno had been granted control over the theater and the invasion. Heinrich may have led the army that got there first, but he answered to Bruno, and Bruno devised the strategy that ended in France's defeat. Even so, Pétain didn't dare call Bruno out on these words. Rather, he was quick to demand a point of these discussions. Fine, have it your way. Regardless of who gets the credit, can you at least tell me now that I am here across the border, why you called me out for this clandestine meeting? Bruno did not speak at first, perhaps building a bit of dramatic effect so that his words held more weight, but when he did utter them, Pétain thought at first he had not heard correctly. There's a lot of old surplus weaponry that the German army, or more specifically its reserves, no longer have use for. I want to donate it to your forces and give them the chance they need to crush the other warlords. Or more specifically, I want it to look like you have accepted Germany's gracious gift, so that they can come here, to Zurich, and negotiate an end to this nonsense once and for all. Pétain was shocked by Bruno's words, and at first thought he wasn't hearing things correctly. And when he was about to ask for clarification on whether or not he had understood Bruno's intent, the man volunteered the information. I bet you're wondering right now if you heard me correctly, and you did. Let me make this abundantly clear. I have had to watch you idiots fight and kill one another on my doorstep for the last 4 years. I would be lying if I said that watching you grind your civilization into dust has not been slightly amusing. But come on, it's been 4 years now. At a certain point, even you Frenchmen have to admit there's nothing left worth fighting over. Pétain first thought Bruno's words were noble, and then began to narrow his eyes in disdain the longer he went on. And by the time the speech was concluded, Pétain could not help but comment. So you think we're an eyesore, is that it? That's your reasoning for helping me end this war and unify France? Bruno's expression did not change in the slightest as he continued to speak in an absolutely deadpan manner. Well, that, and if I'm being honest, the cost of maintaining proper security on the border we share with you is absurd. I'd rather you all get your house in order so we don't have to keep forking over the bill every year. But yes, in essence, France has become an eyesore, and I want the bloodshed to cease. So I will give you the backing, on paper at least, that will intimidate your remaining rivals into kneeling before you. And if they don't, well, I suppose I'll have to actually lend you my toys now, won't I? Over the years, Pétain had heard much about Bruno from a variety of different sources, but he had never expected, after meeting the man, that this was how he would be. Bruno spoke to him like one scolds an errant child. That was how he was speaking to Pétain, who was currently the most legitimate of France's many self-professed national leaders. And the more that Pétain came to understand, he was dealing with a man who thought of him as having little more agency or power than an actual child. the more internally frustrated he became. But he couldn't blow up. Not here. Not now. Not in front of Bruno. To do so would be disastrous for him. And France. No. All the man could really do was sit there in silence as he forcibly calmed himself before finally responding. I will accept whatever assistance you are willing to provide so long as it helps me accomplish my goals. I don't really care what reasoning you have for doing so. But I also know that your word is worth its weight in gold. So I suppose you could say we have an agreement. Would you prefer it in writing? Or shall we shake on it? Bruno stood up and tidied himself off, reaching out his hand with a smirk on his face that made Pétain deeply uneasy for reasons he himself could not explain. All he knew was that the moment he shook Bruno's hand and the man spoke to him, he felt as if he had made a grave mistake. It is much too early to draft formal written accords. Let's just have an old gentleman's agreement under pain of formal dishonor and loss of personal dignity, yes? Chapter 503, Double Agent Part 2. While Pétain and Bruno were meeting in Zurich, Paris was wide open for the first operation of the Gallian militia, which had been reforged under a new banner known as Réveil de France. Soldiers of the National Restorative Government walked through the streets, in uniform, with rifles slung over their shoulders, as the moon was blotted out by the dark storm clouds that threatened to burst at any moment. Yet the city's streetlights, or at least those that had been rebuilt on this particular strip of road, provided illumination for the two soldiers, mere sentries, as they smoked and walked through the streets. So, did you hear? New weapons will be flooded across the border within the next 72 hours. Apparently, that old flamboyant prick actually managed to secure a deal with the Lion of Tyrol. The other soldier took the cigarette right out from under his friend's mouth and smoked the remainder of its contents in their entirety before stomping it beneath his boot, after which he blew the smoke straight in the man's face, while calling him out on his statement and the origin of it. Yeah? Where the hell did you hear such a thing? Our Sarge didn't mention it to me at all. The French youth, barely old enough to carry a rifle, just chuckled as he subtly hinted at his source of information. Let's just say I heard it from someone up the chain of command while delivering a letter to the colonel, and leave it at that. Trust me, man, this war will be over soon. And finally, things can go back to normal. The skeptical soldier shook his head in disagreement with his wide-eyed friend's take. Normal? Look around you. Man, what the fuck is normal? Paris is a fucking ruin. We have to resort to extorting the peasants in the countryside for fucking food to feed its survivors. And those streetlights take up more fucking power than we can reasonably sustain generation of. And you think we're going to just magically go back to the way our country was before the war? No. There's no going back, and rebuilding this shithole is going to be a bigger task than gaining control over its ruins. The two men quickly got into a heated argument over the future of France, not noticing that the nearby vagrants were listening to every word they were saying while pretending to sleep in the ruined streets. Not far away from the city was the farmstead where de Gaulle's new headquarters were. It was not long after the information was observed being spoken by the two sentries did it reach the ears of the resistance. And this had many of them in panic, as they argued about what this meant for their insurgency operations, which had yet to properly begin. New weapons? Like what? Are we expecting panzers to enter France now? If Pétain and his goons get their hands on such things, the war is as good as over, and his dictatorship will reign supreme. Are we really going to sit idly by and let that old vampire suck the lifeblood out of our country? Damn fucking Germans. They really won't be satisfied until France is on her knees groveling before them as a slave. These words in particular drew not only de Gaulle's attention, but Maximilian's as well, who was still posing as a local resistance member named Axel. Though Maximilian remained silent, he watched and waited for de Gaulle's response, hoping not to draw unwanted attention to himself for inserting his own opinion and trying to manipulate the consensus. Luckily for him, de Gaulle seemed to be of a similar mindset, as he questioned the authenticity of the intelligence received from Paris. The Telegraph stated the origins of the intelligence were two enlisted sentries, young men on a walk through a dimly lit street, where they were bored and trying to pass the time. The only reference we have is that this information may have come from a colonel or someone within the chain of command he reported to. But we have as much evidence that this is valid intel as we do that it is nonsense. Until this information is properly verified, there is no need to panic. let alone make a move, understood? No, our plans remain the same. Continue to monitor Maxime Vagon. I want to know his whereabouts at all times and his daily schedule. Once we have confirmed an opportunity, we will take him out, and hopefully before Peyton returns from Switzerland. Now, unless you want to continue arguing over what is little more than schoolyard gossip, get me some goddamn actionable fucking intel. The discourse broke immediately as the rebel fighters murmured while walking off completely disgruntled. All the while de Gaulle sighed heavily and shook his head, approaching Maximilian, who remained behind, and sequestering him away from the others. Not you. You stay? I need to have a word with you, alone. Maximilian did as he was instructed, standing before de Gaulle's sharp and inquisitive gaze, while remaining utterly silent. Ultimately, he found himself under an intense line of questioning he had not been expecting. Are you going to tell me the truth? I thought by now I would have earned that respect. Maximilian was not acting. He was genuinely confused as he tried to comprehend what the former French general turned resistance leader was referring to. Sir, I'm not quite sure. Yet de Gaulle's hand raised, silencing him immediately, as he was quick to cut Maximilian off. Save it. You don't believe after the years I have spent in the field, I can't spot a military man when I see him? I don't remember you having been in Ypres with us when we were in the thick of it. Nor did you immediately volunteer to fight for the Gallian militia when we were purging Paris and the surrounding areas from criminals, degenerates, and Marxists. But you're not like the rest of these pathetic little boys playing as soldier. And it's not just because of you are significantly older than this rabble. Where did you serve? And when? Maximilian suddenly found himself in a dangerous spot, and without the ability to call for extraction. He did not quite know if his cover was blown yet, or if he was still in a position to salvage it. All he knew was that whether or not he lived or died depended entirely on what he said next. Chapter 504. Extracting a Burned Asset. In the years since living as an entitled noble scion, who engaged in petty corruption and racketeering, Maximilian had redeemed himself through service to the German Reich, acting as an agent of military intelligence. During the Great War, he had received great honors for being the man to inspire and lead the Arab rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, while Bruno had brokered the agreement that stabilized the region after the war was over. Maximilian was in the deserts fighting as one of them, and earning the respect of the Sharif of Mecca. Now, however, Maximilian was continuing with his efforts, though thoroughly redeemed in the eyes of his family, peers, and superiors. Maximilian felt he had not yet given enough and undertook the dangerous task of infiltrating de Gaulle's inner circle. Until now, de Gaulle was simply happy to have someone competent among his ranks, as most of his hardened veterans died while trying to defend Paris from Peyton's capture of the city. But this suspected identity could no longer be ignored. And because of this, Axel was quick to come up with a fabrication on the spot that was believable enough to satisfy his interrogator. All right, fine, you got me. I was in Guyana, keeping the peace as a glorified sentry while the rest of you were bleeding in the likes of Ypres. I didn't want to say this, because I'm ashamed I couldn't do more for my country until now. De Gaulle was not thoroughly convinced and was quick to interrogate Maximilian using words that would only be found in the Guyanese dialect of French, which, shockingly, Maximilian responded to perfectly in retort, leaving the man's suspicions thoroughly dispelled, as he asked but one more question to fully confirm this was the truth of Axel's mysterious origins. All right, but tell me this. Why did it take you 4 whole years to arrive here in France? In response to this, Maximilian simply scoffed and rolled his eyes, coming up with the most convenient excuse he could think of. Are you kidding me, sir? Have you ever been to Guyana? It's not exactly a beacon of modern civilization like France is, or was. We struggle for basic power over there. When we lost communication with the homeland, we just continued like business was usual, assuming. It took years just for us to find out that the Republic was gone, and that you were all fighting each other for the vacancy they left behind. In case you didn't realize, chartering a ship across the Atlantic for a war zone is not an easy task. I got here when I could, and that's all that matters, no? De Gaulle nodded his head at Maximilian's words, seemingly convinced by the man's statements, as he dismissed him entirely. I suppose that explains a lot about your behavior. And you're right. It is wise not to tell these men how privileged you were until very recently. They might come to resent you for it. Foolish as it may be, they may not continue to place their faith in you if they come to know you did not endure the same hardships as them. You're free to leave. Continue with your good work and wait for my order. As soon as we have some verified intelligence, Maxime Weygand will die, and we will need every hand we can get on board with the operation. Maximilian nodded at de Gaulle before departing. His heart was pounding rapidly, though his face did not reveal this fact. He needed a breather, and more importantly, time to confirm nobody was stalking him. Once he was certain that he was all alone, he went back into the barn where his radio was hid and called for immediate extraction. The lie he had told de Gaulle would only keep him alive for so much longer. While it wasn't easy to verify his background, if de Gaulle was already suspecting him, then his next step would be to initiate the process to confirm his thoughts. And when that time came, he was as good as dead. Hence, without anybody being any the wiser, Maximilian fled the compound in the middle of the night and headed towards an agreed-upon extraction point, where he met with fellow contacts from German Imperial Intelligence who ensured his safe transfer back beyond the boundaries of the Rhine into the fatherland once more. He had done all he could, and Maximilian could only hope that his efforts had contributed somehow to national security and whatever plans his younger brother was cooking up for France. Bruno saw the message almost immediately after it was sent. Maximilian was in trouble. His cover was on the verge of being blown, and he was requesting emergency extraction under pre-discussed parameters. Naturally, Bruno approved this operation immediately, and agents were dispatched to ensure his older brother's safe return to the Reich. After this, Bruno no longer had a worry in the world regarding Maximilian's safety, because the German Reich's intelligence structure was too robust, too modern, for anyone to properly predict. And naturally, contingencies were in place for extracting burned assets in the field. Methods de Gaulle would never even think of. Rather, Bruno now had to prepare himself for a far more daunting task. He now had no other choice. A conversation would have to be had with his older brother to retire from field operations once and for all. And that was far more terrifying to a man like Bruno than something like charging a machine gun nest in the Ardennes. War was easy, but people? Well, there was an old saying from Bruno's past life that he kept within his personal lexicon for scenarios like this. As he leaned back in his leather-backed office chair, he couldn't help but repeat it aloud with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Hell is other people. With that, Bruno finished his drink and climbed out of his chair, turning off the lights in his office before calling it a night. Tomorrow he had an important conversation to endure, and he did not want an excuse to ignore it. Chapter 505, A Duty Fulfilled. Maximilian had been safely transferred to the Reich, and by the morning of the next day, he had received a nice warm shower, a clean shave and haircut, and was properly dressed in unblemished attire. The man had undergone a full-scale transformation, and he sat before Bruno, not the director of military intelligence, as he spoke of his situation. Bruno sat and listened, drinking from a freshly brewed cup of coffee. Naturally, Maximilian did the same, trying his best to readjust to life within the boundaries of civilization and peace after having spent the better part of the last year in war-torn warlord France. Bruno gave his brother time to come to terms with his thoughts, more than he would do for a normal subordinate who was in a state of relative shock. And eventually, after a long and persistent silence, Maximilian spoke. I want to say before I discuss any of the details of what I have gathered, that I appreciate you prioritizing my rescue, even though I likely had more time to stay behind and continue with espionage. It is most unfortunate that I fled before I could find out about the specifics regarding de Gaulle's conspiracy to assassinate Maxime Weygand. I'm sorry I failed you, Bruno. I mean, Your Majesty. Bruno instantly placed down his cup of coffee on its saucer. He stared at his older brother, who himself looked distressed and full of self-doubt. Frankly speaking, Bruno had never been close with his brothers. He was never as intimate with them as he was with his parents, his wife, and his children. This naturally had to do with their upbringing, and though he had forgiven them all, including Maximilian, for past transgressions, any bonds beyond the most trivial between them had always been weak or non-existent. Still, Bruno knew that Maximilian had, since redeeming himself, been filled with guilt and remorse over the petulant wastrel he had once been, and was constantly looking for some salvation. Because of this, Bruno's words were like a bomb going off in the background when he spoke with genuine kindness and warmth, since he first welcomed Maximilian back into the family after the Great War had come to an end 4 years ago. Max, there is no need for honorifics between us. We may not have gotten along for the first 36 years of my life, but you and I are still brothers. Allow me to be blunt with you. I don't care all that much about Maxime Weygand's life. In fact, if de Gaulle succeeds in his attack, it might be better for the Reich altogether. But even if he was some figure whose protection I highly valued, I would never ask you to risk your life to protect his. Nor would I ever want you to. You felt threatened. Your cover was within the range of being reasonably exposed, and you needed to get out of there. Staying behind to figure out the time and location of the attack would have been suicidal. And you do not need to continue risking your life to prove that you are not the man you were. Maximilian stared in disbelief for a long while, and then he lowered his head in shame. All this time, have I really been the only one who still sees myself as that foolish boy that relied on our father's money to get by in life? Am I really still so foolish? Bruno stood up from his seat and sat down on the sofa in front of his desk that Maximilian was sitting on, now cupping his head with his hands. Bruno patted his brother on the back as he comforted him. It's not as bad as you think. I'm the same way. Nobody in this world is a bigger critic of me than I am to myself. Every time I look in the mirror, I question everything I have ever done. In fact, there are some days in this life where I still fear gazing upon my reflection for too long, because I am fearful of what might look back at me. I suppose every man in this world at some point or another looks at himself in a way that few others perceive him as. And if it makes you feel better, your worst sins are petty compared to mine. Yes, you were selfish, indulgent, abused your status in life for your own benefit, and were even corrupt to a minor degree. But me? Well, let's just say I hope the results of my actions were worth the sins I have committed. Max, if you want my advice, you should retire as a field agent, perhaps take up a higher position, leading a team of men like yourself. Or maybe even instruct the next generation of intelligence assets at the academy. Or you could simply retire altogether and go enjoy the rest of your life with your family. Your contributions to the Reich have already surpassed the realm of redemption, and instead are worthy of praise for centuries to come. Maximilian pulled his head out of his hands to look at Bruno, his previous ashen complexion having returned to a normal and healthy hue, as his own expression appeared less agonized than before. The man placed his hand on Bruno's shoulder and nodded his head in agreement with the suggestion he just heard. I hate to admit it, but I think I agree with you. I'm getting too old for this kind of life. But I suppose that makes the two of us, huh? Bruno, however, did not respond the way Maximilian expected him to. On the contrary, my job these days is mostly administrative. I sit in this office and organize the army and its grand strategic goals. And on some days, if I'm lucky, I rewrite doctrine. But that's a job I can perform well until I begin to develop senility. The Kaiser already forced me out of the field years ago. Maximilian couldn't help but chuckle slightly as he shook his head, standing up from his seat, looking around Bruno's office and the memorized immortalized within it, whether via uniforms and medals earned and worn, or through photographs of battles waged and victory wrought. And after yet another extended pause, Maximilian turned to look back at his younger brother. So this is it, huh? All you aspire to in life? Here in this room? Bruno didn't seem the least bit offended as he leaned back in the sofa and reached towards his brother's cup of coffee that remained untouched, commandeering it for himself as he took a smug sip before responding. Someone has to defend the fatherland. While Bruno's statement was true, it did not dismiss the point that his brother was trying to make, and the man became more confident and stern as he tried to get Bruno to join him in retirement. Yeah, but must it always be you? How long, Bruno? How long do you intend to fight for? You have given more than enough for this country. Don't you deserve some peace? Having struck a nerve of Bruno's, Maximilian didn't realize it until Bruno was sitting upright, his posture no longer relaxed and casual, but straight and stern as his voice was. A wise man just said that peace is just the lull in between battles. There will always be a war to fight, whether it's 5 years from now or 20. Someone has to lead our country to victory. It is my purpose in life, and I will remain in my position until the Kaiser sees fit to remove me from it, or until all our enemies are buried. Either way, I don't suspect that will happen anytime soon. But this is my burden, my cross to bear, and you don't have to force yourself to stay by my side. Maximilian took a while to think through his next statement. He didn't realize that his words would be so provocative to his younger brother, and the last thing he wanted to do after they had just came to a moment of mutual respect and understanding was go back in the wrong direction. Because of this, when he finally spoke, he did so with the weight of a lifetime lived on his shoulders and the regrets he had towards how he had lived it. I envy you. Since you were a child, you seemed to know exactly what you wanted in life, and you never once let anything get in the way of that. I wish I had the same fortitude. Bruno's gaze softened from the borderline aggressive angle they were at just moments before. But when he spoke, his voice was so cold, had almost conjured winter to return. You think I wanted this occupation? Don't get me wrong. I have no regrets, brother. I do not lament the choices I have made in this life. Sure, I may second-guess them now and again, and the whether or not the cost was worth it. Hell, given the same circumstances, I would gladly do so again if it were required of me. But make no mistake, it was never my desire to be a soldier. Rather, it was my duty to be one. If I had it my way, Heidi, myself, and the kids would have been living secluded and happy in a chalet within the Alps. Yet here I am, commanding armies and defending the fatherland. Not because it is what I want, but because it is an obligation. You have served with honor, and your duty has been fulfilled. But mine remains, and shall remain until I am no longer able to fulfill it. Go enjoy your peace, Max, you have earned it. Then Bruno said nothing. He simply returned to his desk and waited silently for Maximilian to excuse himself. Chapter 506. Bluff as Doctrine. De Gaulle realized immediately after Maximilian's disappearance that the man had been a spy. However, he completely misunderstood who had infiltrated his ranks. Believing the man he knew as Axel as having been sent from one of the other warlord factions and not the German Reich. But the fact remained, he had been compromised. His location? Known to an unknown enemy. His plans to assassinate the second-in-command of the National Restoration Government? Also known by the same enemy. Because of this, the plan was immediately aborted, the headquarters abandoned, and relocated. In any reasonable circumstance, this would be more than enough to shake a rival intent on knowing what he and his faction were up to. But was Bruno the type of man to rely on a single spy? Was a Germany operating under his doctrine and understanding? Not at all. Because of this, German military intelligence had spared no expense ensuring that multiple sources of information within de Gaulle's resistance and his inner circle answered to Berlin. As for Pétain, he returned from Zurich to Paris within the same time frame, not surprised in the least that the city and his territory were functioning as planned. However, when Maxime approached the man, he seemed less pleased due to the line of questioning the man had for him. I trust that your meeting with that man has been worth the blow to your legitimacy. Maxime seemed to have a far less favorable impression towards Bruno, ironically making him less than ideal for leadership in the French National Restoration Government as far as the Reich was concerned, despite being infinitely more competent than its current dictator. Pétain's response was brief but stern. Indeed, the Reich has promised to send material support in the form of their retired equipment from the Great War. It should be more than enough to defeat those bastards who refuse to kneel. Whether Pétain was deliberately ignoring the subtext behind the offer given to him, or was genuinely unaware, Maxime did not know, but was quick to clarify, regardless. What do you mean that the Germans are retiring equipment and sending it to our army for aid? What equipment exactly do you speak of? Pétain, seemingly unbothered by the implications, was quick to clarify with exactly what Bruno had promised him. Let's see, Gauer 05S, MG01/03S, MP05S, P05S, Panzer is, Spa Panzer is, and E51s, and various artillery pieces ranging from 7.5 centimeters to 10 centimeters, the same equipment they used to win the war. Why do you ask? Maxime was astonished for reasons beyond Pétain's comprehension, or at least what Pétain displayed openly. And the reason was simple. Maxime understood that if Germany was retiring these weapons and giving them out as material aid to foreign causes, then they had already replaced them with something more ideal. In other words, according to the German Reich, these weapons platforms were already obsolete by their own standards. And yet the rest of the world had yet to fully catch up to them. It was a terrifying thought, one that Maxime appeared to be the only one who truly understood the depth of. Even so, He was just rational enough to calm himself and focus on more immediate concerns after taking a deep breath. Did the man say he would be rechambering these weapons and ammunition we currently have access to? Or are we supposed to rely on German supply going forward? Pétain, having thought nothing more than the surface level of what this gift meant, or at the very least, played the part perfectly, was quick to announce exactly what Bruno had said word for word. I believe what he said was, "I will give you the backing, on paper at least, that will intimidate your remaining rivals into kneeling before you. And if they don't, well, I suppose I'll have to actually lend you my toys now, won't I?" The implication being the transfer of these weapons is meant to force a negotiation from desperation, not actually provide overwhelming firepower. Having heard this, Maxime Dam near suffered from an aneurysm. The reason was simple. What Pétain previously stated was that once more Germany was so far ahead of the rest of the world in arms development that they could give away the weapons that had won the Great War to former rivals and never fear the consequences. But now, this clarification made so much more sense, to him at least. Something he was quick to express while rubbing his temples with closed eyes. "You should have led with that information." Pétain did not appear to understand what precisely he had said that had led his subordinate to become so visibly distressed. Yet he did not immediately make a move to correct that. Instead, he focused on the map in front of them. "Even so, with such weapons on display, even in falsehood, I sincerely doubt the others will continue to resist for long. It was a rather brilliant bluff, one I never would have dared to attempt on my own." This remark, damn, near caused Maxime to double over with incredulity. He wanted more than anything to scream at the man in front of him, but kept his words to himself. "Never would have attempted on your own? That's a bold statement that presumes you were remotely capable of doing so before receiving support from someone else." Ultimately, only time would tell before Bruno's gamble played off, or whether or not he would have to play a more hands-on approach to end the war in France and ensure that a proper puppet rose to power. But the message would be clear soon enough. As weapons continued to flood across the border, Pétain was gearing up for war, and with equipment that the enemy would not be capable of contending with. If that even on the surface did not force a negotiation, then Bruno could truly confirm he was not dealing with people that had any sense of logic, reason, or self-preservation left within their bones. And if this was the case, well then, there was no point continuing towards a peaceful and diplomatic resolution to the ongoing crisis. Chapter 507, Knowledge is Power. Bruno sat in his office, observing intelligence reports from France and all of its warlords' domains. There was a saying in life, knowledge is power, and if that were true, then there was certainly no more powerful man in this world than Bruno. He liked to know everything, where his enemies were, what they were plotting, where they slept, what they had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, what they were doing on a Tuesday afternoon at precisely 2:19 p.m. There was not a world where Bruno could accurately predict how his enemies would try to counter him without first knowing everything there was to understand about them. And he made damn well sure over the course of the last 20 years that Germany's intelligence networks were more than capable of providing this information. Hell, if he wanted a routine report on the bowel movements of a particular target, within a week, there would be a lengthy study on his desk. That was how much importance Bruno put on knowledge. It was because of this that he was not the least bit surprised how his enemies in France reacted the moment the new equipment provided by the German Reich's reserve stockpiles ended up in the hands of Pétain's army. To put it simply, the remaining warlords who had not bent the knee already were terrified to the point of competing with one another for the chance to do so. These were weapons that had broken the Allies single-handedly, and these men, running around with water-cooled machine guns, garage-built carbines of questionable durability, and leftover weapons from a variety of nations though they were going to win? Not the slightest chance in hell was this the case. Thus, after 4 long and bloody years, the time for France to negotiate an end to their ongoing civil war and hostilities had finally come to an end. Pétain and his representatives planned to meet with the other warlords of France within neutral territory. No, it was not Zurich this time, but rather Geneva, as he and Bruno were said to have met, but in reality did not. The world watched in curiosity at whether this meeting could truly settle a peaceful resolution to ongoing conflict in France. As for Bruno, he met with the Kaiser, the Tsar, and the young Archduke of Austria in Berlin, where they had their own conference, which coincided with the one in Geneva. Bruno sat at the edge of the table opposite of Wilhelm's. Though his back was facing the door, which was unusual for him, he himself gazed upon the windows behind his emperor. It was a position that even Wilhelm found unusual and was quick to question before their other guests arrived. "Must you really sit so far away from my side? Is there something I'm not understanding about your choice of seat?" Bruno realized instantly that his spot may have caused questions to the man he swore fealty to, considering his rightful place was at the man's right side. But nevertheless, he was quick to explain why he had chosen this particular spot. "Your Majesty, your spot is at the head of the table, facing any threats that may try to break through the door behind me. And if that is the case, my spot is not by your side, but across from you, to ensure that no fiend tries to take your life from outside the windows. It is a matter of operational security. Just as I trust you to secure the space behind me, I will do the same for you. That is all there is to it." Frankly speaking, Wilhelm knew Bruno's character well enough to the point where he could not understand if the man was actually thinking in terms of pragmatic security or if he was simply trying to avoid close contact with other people. Bruno had strangely enough been a man to avoid friendship with others who did not directly share his burdens. It was no secret that Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II had both thought of Bruno as a close personal friend, yet Bruno kept them at arm's length for whatever reason. Because of this, Wilhelm could only sigh and accept the man's reasoning, as the Tsar and Archduke coincidentally entered the room at just the right time to prevent him from complaining. And as such, once they were all seated, and given a proper refreshment in the form of tea and sweets, Bruno, being the notable exception of coffee and hash browns, Wilhelm began to speak his mind. "We all know why I have requested this conference. France appears to be at the precipice. If all goes smoothly, they will unify under Pétain's banner. If that is the case, we will have a stable, but mostly hostile neighbor to deal with in the West. If not, then the war will continue and more drastic measures will need to be taken. I wanted to hear all of your thoughts on this matter. Considering we all have so much to lose in the event that another great war were to break out as a result of this mess." Nicholas and Karl remained utterly silent, as if they were thinking through Wilhelm's words. And it was then that Bruno spoke, interrupting them all as he clarified his stance on the ongoing French convention in Geneva. "Your Majesty, you really should have spoken to me about this matter before summoning Nicholas and Karl all the way here to Berlin. The situation in France is well under control. There is a 90% chance that these negotiations at the very least result in a ceasefire, let alone a full-blown unification. And if that is the case, the refugees we have taken in over the last 4 years, who are eternally thankful to your benevolence, will be excellent spies to send back to France to keep an eye on the coming developments of the new regime. And should Pétain's government prove hostile, they will also be an excellent tool to foster rebellion and replacement. Either way, the real concern is not Pétain and his charade in Geneva. Rather, it's de Gaulle and his attempts to overthrow the current order and replace it with a new republic built on revanchism and irredentism. If that were to happen, a second Great War would be inevitable within 3 decades. The room was utterly silent as Bruno concluded his statement, as if he had just dropped a major bomb and disrupted any notions that the world leaders sitting in front of him had understood prior to this moment. Chapter 508, Restoration of France. In the city of Geneva, within its most grand hotel, hosted a meeting of warlords. Men who had, over the course of the last 4 years, fought with tooth and nail for everything they currently held. Each was battle-hardened, with a cadre of blood-soaked veterans behind them, whether survivors of the Great War or the next generation raised in its catastrophic aftermath. And all of them were convinced they were the legitimate ruler of France. There was only one name who had grown infamous over the course of France's civil war who was not present at this meeting: Charles de Gaulle. The reason for this was simple. The Gallian militia had been slain by Pétain's National Restorative Army in a battle for the control of Paris and its surrounding regions. In fact, by now de Gaulle had not been seen in months, rumored to have either fled to the colonies, the New World, or perhaps had even perished without record. Either way, to the men at this table he was a non-issue. Rather, their most pressing concern was the man sitting at the head of the table. Philippe Pétain was perhaps the only warlord to rise from the ashes of the Republic who was an actual legitimate extension of the previous regime. What with being the commander-in-chief of the French army during the final days of the war. But that was not the reason that the other warlords were so wary of him. Their intelligence reported trains upon trains coming in from across the Rhine, carrying armor, artillery, aircraft, and crates filled with weapons and munitions. Logistic complexities aside, the National Restoration Army now had the means to steamroll their opposition, and only a fool would not come to this discussion before losing any position they had to negotiate with the advantage. It was clear that Pétain was willing to make some concessions in order to end the civil war and unify France beneath his banner, and thus the men gathered, many of which had various ideological sentiments, were quick to discuss these matters openly and without restraint. I won't lie to you. With Wagon joining your ranks and new equipment flooding through from east of the Rhine, you have put me in a very difficult position. With that said, I am hoping that perhaps the unpleasantness of a Pyrrhic victory on your part in exchange for my defeat can be avoided entirely. The man who spoke was Henri Giroux, one of the more prominent warlords. His uniform was clean, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion, and judging by his choice of words, he was making a covert threat, one that was hidden behind just enough words not to provoke an immediate response. This, of course, prompted Pétain to frown, but he did not raise his voice in response, nor did he threaten the man in a similar way. Instead, he spoke calmly and clearly about his intentions. I understand the sentiment well. Each and every one of us here has spent the past 4 years gaining our respective domains and fortifying them significantly. To encroach on anyone's territory at this point would be inviting conflict beyond its worth. It is why I have asked you all to join me here. In an attempt to end the senseless bloodshed that has been draining our nation of its lifeblood, and instead to come to some form of compromise which each and every one of us can agree with. Let me make myself abundantly clear. Since 1914, millions of French men have died in combat. Whether in the Great War or this mess, we have all inherited as a result of it. Millions more have been maimed beyond the point of recovery, either physically or mentally. In addition to this, each and every one of us has drafted the next generation so that they may share the same fate. If we do not stop now, there will be no future for France, as there will be too few men to carry on with her history. We have collectively ensured that our nation will not recover from this madness, not in full, until long after I am dead, even if that occurs from natural causes. To put it simply, it has to end here and now with us, before we make matters much, much worse. Or does anyone here think that their personal claim to leadership is worth more than France herself? Utter silence remained across the room for a long time. All had known the price they had paid up until this point, but few were willing to admit it. The sunk cost fallacy was a hell of a drug, and these men had continued to throw bodies into the meat grinder, knowing that they had already spent so much that the only way they could justify it was if they won it all in the end. But Pétain's words cut right through that mentality and made these men realize they were on the brink of annihilation as a nation, as a culture, and as a people. And that annihilation was not from anyone outside France, but the French people themselves. When this became abundantly clear to all the warlords, each and every one of them had a sudden sobering realization that they were truly at a turning point here and now, and that they had one last chance to make things work for them. Thus, with this said, the negotiations truly began. It was not long after Bruno, Wilhelm, Karl, and Nicholas were gathered in the Kaiser's palace in Berlin. They were having their own discussion, that is until a German officer entered the room and whispered something to Bruno before departing without saying another word. The other monarchs were curious enough for what had transpired that prompted such a brief and seemingly unremarkable interruption, and Karl was the first to give voice to these thoughts. Is something the matter? Bruno, sipping his coffee and eating one of the hash brown patties that lay next to it, still warm to the touch, only spoke after he had swallowed, and when he did so his voice was as calm as a summer breeze. Nothing of importance. Pétain seems to have achieved a miracle and convinced the other warlords in France to lay down their arms and agree to a temporary armistice, as they begin the process of jointly reforming the French government. It would appear the war beyond our western borders is coming to an end, assuming nothing is done in the next few weeks to throw a wrench into these plans. Wilhelm knew enough of Bruno's more Machiavellian nature that he concealed behind the guise of chivalry and duty that the man was more than likely hinting at something he himself was involved with, or at the very least, knew more about and refused to interfere with, and was thus forced to inquire further. It sounds to me like you are keeping us in the dark. Who would dare throw a wrench into such plans? Bruno's gaze narrowed as he repeated the message he had said just moments before the interruption. But de Gaulle, of course. If France unifies without his input, it would be proof of his propaganda, or at least according to him, and those who agree with his ideals. The new French government would be illegitimate in the eyes of the revanchists and irredentists. As from their perspective, Pétain's new regime will merely be a German puppet. A lie, of course, but a convenient one for those who refuse to acknowledge their past failures and release their illegitimate claims over our lands. Wilhelm went silent. He understood the full depth of why Bruno had said that de Gaulle was the biggest thorn in their side just moments before, and he was now inclined to agree with Bruno's assessment. Meanwhile, Nicholas was quick to ask the question that was on both his and Karl's mind. Well, can't we do something about de Gaulle and his petty band of rebels? It might not seem like much now, but we all know what happened in Russia in 1904, and how quickly those Bolshevists turned into an empire-wide problem. We can't just leave him to fester and rot like a cancer. Bruno, however, shook his head and sighed heavily, admitting he was at a loss for what to do here. We can't make a move without proving de Gaulle is right, and in doing so, turn him into a martyr, assuming we succeed in whatever endeavor you are suggesting. And if that happens, he will indeed spark another civil war. The least we can do is coordinate with Pétain's law enforcement agents and give them information that we know regarding this rebellion that calls itself Réveil de France. Hopefully, his forces will now be capable enough to combat its growing influence. But that is a problem for another day. They won't immediately reveal themselves, not after this news. Rather, like all ideological fanatics, they will wait for their enemy to rebuild society, so they don't have to do a job they are not capable of performing. And once France is functional again, and they are largely forgotten, then they will strike, and when they do, they will scurry like rats and hide underground to repeat the same behavior. It is what their types always do. So unfortunately, we now have to wait until then. If I were you all, I would increase border security and law enforcement measures within your own respective domains over the course of the next few years, not decrease them. The last thing we need is for a few of these rats to slip into our homes bearing the plague. Chapter 509, Getting Old. Though graffiti and propaganda leaflets continued to spread throughout the cities of France, following its unification under Pétain's new regime, the so-called Réveil de France remained quiet and largely inactive. And they had remained quiet for years following the official end of the French Civil War. The reason was simple. The brutality of the new order had quickly caused those with a spirit for liberty to rally behind de Gaulle's cause. But this was not a concern for Bruno. Rather, as 2 years passed, he was forced to confront more personal matters. Marrying off his son had been one thing, but Bruno had not truly anticipated how he would feel in 1922, when both his daughter Elsa and her fiancé Alexei Romanov had finally come of age to marry. It was not some inappropriate feeling between a father and his daughter that caused such troubles, but rather how much he would miss the girl once she had left his home and moved to Russia to be with her new husband. To be so far away from home, to no longer interact with his daughter daily, it was not something he had truly understood the weight of until the day rapidly approached. Because of this, Bruno was dreading each rotation of the sun, whereas Elsa became more and more excited about her upcoming wedding. The planning was left up to Heidi and the Tsarina, both of which gathered frequently in Russia, along with Bruno and his children that still lived at home to plan the ceremony. But there was another among the group who was less than stellar about the thing. Eva had her own reasons for being pouty, standing aside at the table, drinking vodka, along with her father, both of which kept their distance from the social gathering for their own reasons. And both understood why the other was feeling glum. Eva knew her father doted on his little girls more than anything, and to see one of them finally spreading her wings and flying was a bit too much for him to handle. Whereas Bruno knew that Eva was also incredibly jealous of the status quo. She was engaged to the Crown Prince Wilhelm, who was about 5 years younger than him, meaning that he would turn 18 2 years from now. But Elsa was much closer in age to her fiancé. There was only about a year apart from them. As the oldest sister, it rubbed Eva the wrong way that her little sister was getting married before her, and thus she could only drink with her father and shake her head, as the two of them silently groaned about the passing of time and the changes that came with it. You know, Eva, it's going to kill me to see Elsa shipped off to Russia. Do you have any idea the expense I will have to pay to fly between Innsbruck and St. Petersburg every week? Eva rolled her eyes at her father's nonsense. Of course, the man would conceal the fact the thought of his daughter's absence was what was really killing him. No, he had to make it about itemized bills, expenses incurred during transit, and of course no doubt he was just about to complain about the time traveled between. I mean, do you have any idea how long a flight takes across such a distance? Eva could not help but roll her eyes once more, this time adding an audible sigh to her repertoire as she amused her father's ramblings because she knew how much this change meant to him. Well, judging from our flight this morning, I would say it is approximately 10 hours, depending on whether the conditions are favorable or not. Bruno took a sip from his glass and nodded his head in approval at Eva's statement, while adding more feigned distress over travel time. And do you have any idea how much that time adds up to if I'm flying out every weekend to see my baby girl? It's exhausting. Eva silently sipped on her drink, while looking over at her younger sister, who flashed her a pretty smile in between talking with her mother and future mother-in-law about the decorations and other such nuances that went into planning a grand wedding worthy of an imperial dynasty. The entire room was filled with planners of every kind. Nothing was being overlooked for the sake of this event, least of all security, which Nicholas spoke to regarding, as he was more involved with the planning for that than anything else. As for Eva, upon seeing her sister's smile, she smiled back before turning to her father and expressing her own lament over this whole ordeal. God, I hate her. Bruno chuckled. Seeing his eldest daughter's petty jealousy was enough to snap him back into reality and away from his overly concerned and doting father mode. You know, in 2 years you will have to go through all of this as well. Eva, however, denied her father's attempts to get her to reconcile with her sister, and instead smirked smugly with her response. Yes, but unlike Elsa, I will be moving to Berlin, and it won't be such a hassle for us to meet and continue with my education. Now will it, father? Bruno couldn't but help but shake his head and laugh. His daughter had already seen through his complaints about how difficult it was to visit St. Petersburg, a mere smokescreen to hide from the fact he was feeling glum about the idea that all 3 of his eldest children would be moving away from the home and no longer be a daily part of his life. After taking another sip of his vodka, Bruno couldn't help but sigh and look over at Elsa, who despite her best trying to maintain a sense of calmness and control, was very clearly anxious beneath her frozen facade. Where does the time go? I suddenly find myself feeling so old. Eva couldn't help but scoff at her father's remarks, assuring him he was anything but. Please, father, with the way our family ages, you won't be old until you hit 70. Have you looked in the mirror lately? You're almost 42 and still have all your blonde hair and barely any marks of age on your face. You and mother easily look a decade younger than you are, and if my uncles and grandparents are anything to go by, this seems to be a trait that runs in the family. Bruno nodded his head in agreement with his daughter's words, but was quick to deny them all the same. While I may not physically age at the same rate as most people, you should remember, Eva, that age is a state of mind. And I feel ancient these days. I'm going to go speak with your sister. You should do the same when you're ready. After saying this, Bruno placed his drink down upon the counter and left Eva's side, instead going over to sit next to his wife, as he forced himself into the conversation seamlessly, as if he were a naturally gregarious person and not simply one who had adapted to the role as it was a necessary circumstance in his life. As for Eva, she silently stared at the bottom of her drink and sighed, finishing it off with one solid gulp before placing down the glass on the counter next to her father's and following his advice. The United States was now in a transitionary state. The Mexican Revolution had ended, and the new government was a puppet of Washington, allowing for many agreements, treaties, and deals that were favorable to those who resided north of the Rio Grande. Meanwhile, industry had begun to return to the United States to some degree, and its military continued its modernization efforts. Not wanting to be left behind by Europe, which intelligence from its ongoing battlefields suggested the United States had fallen dreadfully behind the rest of the world in such matters. Socially, it was a time of change. Every man and woman with minor limitations now had the right to vote. And with that came sweeping social reforms, like prohibition, spurred on primarily by the female demographic of the new voter bloc. There was just one problem with this. Banning a substance outright, with limited exceptions that was readily available and could be made in someone's garage, was a surefire way to instigate a crime wave. And it was no doubt that shortly after the prohibition of alcohol had become a constitutional amendment across the United States, the rise of criminal organizations monopolizing the outlawed demand rose with them. As a result, the United States was in a rough shape as President Hughes debated on how to proceed. It had been some time since he contacted Bruno, or vice versa. And yet, with the rise of violence across American cities, he had to do something about it. The phone tempted him, called to him like a seductress. Yet his hand did not reach for it. Until it did. Chapter 510, The Ice Princess Bride. Before Bruno knew it, the day had arrived. During Erwin's wedding, Bruno had maintained a respectable distance, allowing his son to become a man in full. But tonight one of his little girls was being handed off to her husband. It was an entirely different affair. And because of this, Bruno inspected Elsa's changing room after knocking to ensure she was decent. The door opened to reveal Heidi, Eva, and the bridesmaids all gathered around Elsa. She was dressed in the latest fashion of German aristocratic design. Elegant, conservative, beautiful. Her dress was whiter than the snow, unblemished, untainted. The girl's platinum blonde hair was tied up into an elegant and braided bun. Her veil cast behind her face as she held a bouquet of white roses in her hands. Elsa was anxious. Her flushed cheeks betrayed her. The familiar ice princess facade had vanished, and that alone told Bruno how hard she was trying to keep it together. Meanwhile, Heidi approached her man and asked him the question that if about any other women would get him in trouble if he answered accurately. She's beautiful, isn't she? Our daughter is the living personification of an ice goddess. Bruno dragged his wife in close and kissed her on the lips. He didn't know exactly how to respond to this statement. On the one hand, he could state that his wife was the fairest maiden of them all, but on his daughter's wedding day, when she was so lavishly dressed, no, that would wound his daughter's pride. And Bruno could never do that. Instead, after taking his wife into his arms and holding her tight, Bruno's gaze shifted towards Elsa's figure and was quick to come up with a compromise. She is as radiant as her mother was on her own wedding night. This was a remark that was deemed acceptable by both women, causing Elsa to rush forward and join the hug with her mother and father. Oh, Daddy, I love you both so much. Thank you for always being there for me while growing up. Both Elsa and Heidi were trying their best to hold back their tears, lest they ruin their makeup, while Bruno himself couldn't help but pat the girl's head one last time, before sending her off. You don't have to thank me, baby girl. It was my honor, and my duty as my father to raise you right. Now I think we have kept your guests waiting long enough, don't you think? Bruno hooked his arm around his daughter's and dragged her off to the venue where the groom was waiting for his bride-to-be. The music played as the sun illuminated the St. Isaac's Cathedral and its sublime interior. The groom stood at the altar, waiting for his bride to walk down the aisle. And there she came, dressed like a true imperial consort of the next Tsar of Russia. By her side was her father, locked arm in arm, escorting her to the altar as he should. Bruno was dressed as extravagantly as his daughter, but it was not his German field marshal's uniform, which he normally wore for formal occasions such as this. Rather, he had dusted off his old Russian ceremonial uniform, and the medals he was given for the part he played in winning the Russian Civil War for the House of Romanov. The guests gathered varied from the extended families of both sides, to the houses of Hohenzollern, Habsburg, and various others from across the German Reich, Russian Empire, and Europe as a whole. At the end of the walk, Bruno handed his daughter off to Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, which thanks to Bruno's actions, in this life had managed to grow into a fine young man, unburdened by the illness that kept him infirm in his youth. Bruno's investments into the field of medicine and the creation of a joint Russo-German research bloc allowed for Alexei's condition to be treated in a way that mitigated its effect on his daily life. The young boy who had been slain too young in his past life by the wickedness of Karl Marx and the murderous madman his beliefs had spawned stood in full ceremonial regalia, a true prince, one who would one day come to the throne in his own right. And on his face was astonishment, as his wife took his hand at the altar, smiling, in a way she had seldom done in public, bashful, meek, embarrassed. And him the same. Neither of them knew what was happening in the world beyond where their eyes met, until the traditional Orthodox wedding ceremony was concluded, and they were named husband and wife. Their kiss had been photographed and published in the papers. It was an image that would one day be the subject of many paintings that would become quite legendary in their own right. And once Elsa had been kissed by her groom, Heidi, who was standing in front and center in the pews, finally couldn't hold the tears back and began to cry profusely with joy in Bruno's arms. Bruno gazed upon the scene with a complicated slurry of emotions. This sight of his children marrying and living happy lives, unburdened by the hell he had once lived through. Well, what parent wouldn't want that for their child? Time and again, Bruno knew that family was his reason for moving forward, for digging his hands into the filth and getting himself dirty, just zero so that they would not have to. It was his reason for fighting, enduring, and continuing when it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. And more often than not, this was not just a feeling, but the reality of his circumstances. And yet in that moment, blinded by the light of the heavens, Bruno remembered, this life was no accident. His presence here wasn't luck. It was providence, ordained by the Father above. After all, how else could he have been born again in precisely the place needed to save the world from its fate? Chapter 511, Mobland. East Harlem, New York City. A slum, a ghetto, or a charming and quaint part of town just in need of a little renovation. That would depend on who you asked. But one thing was certain. In 1920s America, it was the same as it was in Bruno's past life. Teeming with greaseballs and dirtbags. Men who would rather steal from others through brute force and intimidation than work an honest day's wage. And these days were no different. Sure, there were still more honest men and women than crooks, but not enough to keep the streets clean. And it's not like this kind of behavior was exclusive to the Italians. Hell, the Irish, the Jews, and all the other recent immigrant groups had some kind of criminal racket going on. But the Italians? Well, they were the first to turn it into something on the scale of an empire. And in 1922, that was the trajectory that was happening. Bootlegging was big business. Alcohol was the lifeblood of civilization. It had been brewed since before properly paved streets were a thing, and was the way many a man coped with the stresses of life. To ban it, to strip it away outright, well, that was a difficult thing to process, especially in a society that had chosen to do so seemingly overnight to many who were caught unprepared for the sudden changes in society. In Chicago, a war was already being waged between the Italian South Side gang and the Irish North Side gang. But New York? New York was notoriously bloody, and they had not even begun getting into the thick of it yet. Either way, President Hughes, who was now halfway through his second term, was at an impasse. He had promised security, prosperity, and independence for the Americans. But the headlines made the violence appear so much worse than it was. The odds were, if you were not a part of that lifestyle, you weren't going to get shot, stabbed, or disappeared. But the public, unaccustomed to any crime being this publicized, and this bloody now that a new generation of weapons was hitting the American streets, well, they had a way of overreacting to sensationalism. After all, they had been lied to by the papers already, stating that alcohol was to blame for a number of issues facing American society, like domestic violence, child abandonment, among others. But the reality was, this was such a small fraction of the population that if you were to speak to someone in 2025 about these statistics, they'd almost call it utopian compared to what was normal in the century to come. Even so, headlines blamed alcohol, and moral busybodies rushed to the polls to outlaw it. And in doing so, creating yet another problem that they were now panicking over. Hughes needed a solution, but he had few options. Police were taking bribes, and so were judges and district attorneys. Nobody could be counted upon to bring these lawless gangs to justice. And in his hour of need, he finally broke. He tried to dial Bruno's number multiple times, but never quite got through. The first time this happened, he stormed off and tried his best to come up with a solution on his own, which ended up failing horrifically. Then there was the second time, and now finally, on his third try, President Hughes was huffing and puffing as the dial tone continued. But this time, there was an audible click followed by a familiar voice. "Mr. Hughes. Well, this was a call I was not expecting. What can I do for you?" There were no words to describe the fury that the President of the United States was forced to stifle in that moment. Bruno finally accepted his call after months of trying to get a hold of him, and had the gall to act as if this was the first time he was remotely aware of it. However, Hughes had dealt with Bruno long enough to understand that lashing out at the man and trying to screw him over was not a way to get what he wanted. Thus, he calmed himself. I'm afraid I need your help. I don't know who else to turn to at this point, but I fear if something isn't done about this problem soon, my party will lose the next election." There was silence for a while, until finally Bruno's voice, calm and all-knowing, came across the other line like a prophet who had already seen the future well in advance. "Yes, I suppose it is around that time. The gangs you are having trouble dealing with, don't worry about them. I'll take care of it." And then there was nothing but a click. Bruno had once more hung up on the President of the United States, as if his call was a matter of inconvenience that he was waiting for the first opportunity to drop. But that didn't make Hughes furious, because Bruno had already known what he was dealing with, and said one phrase, that he would take care of it. And when Hughes remembered how Bruno had a habit of taking care of issues, he sank back in his chair, all the breath in his lungs escaping his body in that moment, as he wondered whether or not he had just opened Pandora's box. What have I just unleashed? Meanwhile, Bruno was in his home office, in Tyrol, gazing at an image of him and his family they had taken years ago, while in Transylvania together. He smiled, and then put the photo down, dialing another number, one he had not called in quite a while. "Yes, I wish to speak with Commandant Rome. Yes, I have a job for him and his outfit. A matter that needs to be handled delicately and discreetly. He will know who I am by the nature of the task." "Yes, that is correct. Good then, I will await his call." After hanging up the phone, Bruno sat at his desk, his fingers crossed in contemplation. He would sit like this for well over an hour, motionless, until finally standing up and exiting his office without saying a word. Only he knew what he was thinking and what he was planning to do. Chapter 512, Crate Job. New York Harbor. Half the traffic going to and from across the Atlantic came through here, bringing not just passengers and freight, but contraband hidden in unlisted crates, like the ones that had just arrived from Portugal. A group of dock workers pulled these illicit crates and transferred in the back of an automobile, clearing any inspection by the authorities, and found themselves in a local pub named Das Vaterland, in a district of the city occupied largely by immigrants from the German world. Das Vaterland wasn't just a name, it was a statement. And now, thanks to the latest cargo, it was also a war room. Once dropped off at the back of the pub, via the entry point reserved for shipping, the crates were dragged inside by some local workers, and then handed off to a back room, a residence by the looks of its furnishings. One completely unlisted as far as Uncle Sam was concerned. But there was not just one man, and maybe his squeeze, sitting in this hidden apartment. No, there were 5 men, dressed like Union men. Wool shirts, suspenders, dungarees, and a flat-brim cap were their style. Their skin, fair, their eyes, a mixture of blue, green, and hazel depending on the man. These were clearly German men, and when they cracked open the crates to reveal what was inside, they spoke a local dialect of the German tongue. "My God, is that what I think it is?" A chuckle, followed by a jovial comment. "Take a look, boys. Christmas came early, and you better give a special thanks to our friends in the fatherland for our new toys." What he was referring to was several stacks of MP34s, refurbished after use during the Great War. Magazines and spam cans filled with ammunition were also included in another crate. The men racked the charging handles on an empty chamber and gazed down the iron sights, as if they were truly celebrating Christmas. God bless the Reich. These ought to be more than enough to deal with that bastard Rothstein. What's the play, boss? One man alone was not giggling like a schoolgirl. It was the boss of the gang, composed of German Americans, who by now were likely second or third generation immigrants to the country. Unlike his cronies, he was dressed in a lavishly tailored 3-piece suit and smoked a cigar silently while watching his goons break out into laughter and cheers over their new weaponry. His eyes were cold, and he clearly was not like the rest of his men. His tone held a distinctive accent from the fatherland as he spoke to his soldiers. The plan is simple. We know where the prick stays, and we know when he leaves his little club. His voice continued on, masking his malevolence with kind language and a compassionate tone. You lot are going to drive up to him as he exits the building, where I want you to send him a friendly message and a gift of lead. When the man lowered his cigar, breathing out the smoke captured in his mouth, he did so. It revealed a distinctive signet ring, one that belonged to a unique group of ex-convicts within German society. A group Bruno, during the Great War, had weaponized the Feldgendarmerie against. This man was clearly a more recent immigrant, and if his appearance was anything to go by, he was a member of a German organized crime syndicate known as the Ringverein, one that had been forced to flee the fatherland under Bruno's ruthless pursuit of crime and degeneracy in the streets of the Reich. As for his goons, they immediately knew what the man was thinking and inserted their loaded magazines into their new submachine guns. We'll take care of it, boss. You just thank your friends in the fatherland on our behalf. With that said, the men grabbed some bandanas to conceal their faces and hopped in the nearest car, driving off into the night as they did so. Arnold Rothstein was among the first bootleggers to make it big in the United States after Prohibition was enacted. But that wasn't the only business of ill repute he ran. Whether it was running gambling rings, fixing sports events, or general protection rackets, he was known in Bruno's past life as the first among America's 20th century gangsters to treat crime like a legitimate business. If given enough time, he would go on to become the mentor to several notable Italian-American mafioso, including the infamous Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who himself would go on to found the Commission in 1931, transforming La Cosa Nostra from individual crime families localized to their own city blocks to the United States' first national crime syndicate. But tonight was not that night. No, Arnold Rothstein would find himself walking out of his club, as he did most nights, and when he did, he found a car full of masked men pointing military-grade hardware at him and his bodyguards. Nothing was said, no sound but the pitter-patter of machine gun fire, which shredded Arnold Rothstein and his fellow mobsters apart in the streets. And then in the silence that followed the burning of rubber as the Model T drove off into the night. Not anyone the wiser of who had just pulled off the hit against one of New York's most powerful gangsters. President Hughes didn't realize it, at least not at first. But when he called upon Bruno for help, Bruno answered in the most obvious way to him. If there was a war being fought, the best way to win it without personally getting involved is to pick a side and arm them to the teeth. And that was exactly what he had done to one of the local and small German-American gangs. When the American president realized that his request opened the door for further violence, instigated by the German Reich, he would feel like he had made the biggest mistake of his political career. Of course, while the streets might have escalated in bloodshed, and would continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Now that military-grade firepower had been handed to a single gang, the chaotic war for dominance would burn hotter, but in far quicker and bloodier than anyone in Washington had ever intended. Chapter 5:13, The Italian Question. War may be escalating in the streets of New York, but Berlin was safer than ever. And before Bruno realized it, 2 more years had passed. It was now 1924, and it had been 8 years since the Great War had come to an end in this life. France had just begun to recover. For years after the National Restoration Government was declared under Pétain's dictatorship, the nation had begun the process of reconstruction. Cruel as it may be, civilization was finally restored to the lands of west of the Rhine. Meanwhile, Britain had long since stopped reeling from the injuries inflicted upon it during the Great War. King George may have dissolved Parliament for a time to restore order to the nation, but the British Empire found a way to become an adversary of the Reich once more. In fact, it began fostering trade with the United States post-war, increasing ties to its former colonies and what remained of its current roster. This had instigated some form of economic recovery despite the damage dealt to the empire's treasury during the war. Italy, having gotten off easier than the other allies, with being forced to pay reparations to damages they caused in the war and ceding claims over Habsburg-owned territories, had not given birth to radical communists or fascism. For starters, the Bolsheviks were slain in a decade earlier in this life, their revolution a monumental failure. and the Reds in France were also rooted out early by the warlords. Socialism had no place in the eyes and conscience of common men across Europe. It was seen as an ideology for anarchists, criminals, and sociopaths to rally behind. And frankly, that was a realistic depiction of those drawn to its ideals. But Italy's place in the world was still uncertain following the Great War. They had time to rebuild peacefully, but many within the nation believed they no longer held prestige or power as a respectable nation. Italy was at a crossroads. It could fall to republicanism and become another threat on the Reich's southern border to worry about in the future. Or it could be incorporated into dynastic alliances Bruno was forging. Because of this, Bruno sent a letter to King Emmanuel III, requesting the man come visit him in Tyrol as a guest, not a diplomat. Bruno wanted to show him something. While the rest of the world reeled from the aftermath of the Great War a decade after it had begun, Germany had emerged stronger, brighter, and more united than ever. Crime was at an all-time low, and the Kaiser was more powerful than ever. And the Reich's alliance with the Russian Empire had propelled the two nations to greater heights than mankind was capable of imagining. Tyrol, after 8 years of reforging in the aftermath of the Great War, became a symbol of the future. Its cities were rebuilt to respect the old architecture, but incorporate new technologies. Airfields, highways, high-speed rails, and most importantly, new energy systems. Whether it was Tesla's wireless resonance grid acting as the primary form of energy in the Grand Principality of Tyrol, or backup systems integrated into it, like small modular geothermal plants, environmentally friendly hydroelectric dams, solar panels seamlessly integrated into rooftops, and battery storage facilities strategically fortified within the nation's reserves. Tyrol had become a beacon of a world without reliance on 19th-century energy production. And currently, significant gains towards the research and development of small, modular, thorium-powered nuclear fission salt reactors, which would act as the final redundancy in the future of Russo-German energy output. But for now, it was still a technology under prototyping. Even so, when King Emmanuel III walked among Innsbruck's streets, witnessing the future lying before him, he could not form words to accurately convey his thoughts. Bruno had taken the man out to a local restaurant. The two of them sat and dined on fine Tyrolean cuisine as Bruno dropped a major bombshell on the King of Italy. I know I asked you here to my lands as a guest, but I have to ask, what is your opinion of Italy's current place in the world? Emmanuel III was indeed stupefied by Bruno's remarks. So much so, he did not initially react to the words spoken to him. And then after turning and facing Bruno, who was rather happily spooning Käsespätzle into his mouth, and then it suddenly hit him. Bruno was a man who people had warned him would make you feel like a friend, comfortable, and then he would bind you to him in a way you never expected. The Italian king's voice trembled as if he was gazing upon the devil sitting in front of him, enjoying a nice meal at a local restaurant. Well, what do you think about Italy's current situation? Bruno either pretended not to notice the anxiety being displayed by his guest, or was genuinely ignorant of it, as he responded with a casual tone in his voice. I think it has two paths lying before it. One is to become a friend of the Reich, and a valued partner for the foreseeable future in the alliance that has been built between Germany and Russia. The way Bruno trailed off intrinsically baited the Italian king to inquire further, pulling him out of his own hesitation as he did exactly that. And the other? Bruno took a sip of beer, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and spoke as if discussing the weather. What came next, however, was anything but casual. Or it can oppose the Reich. And we both remember how that ended. For you. King Emmanuel III sat in utter horror as he heard these words. Remembering how his pride of not being invited to joint military exercises between Russia, Germany, and Austro-Hungary, who he was technically aligned with at the time, drove him to Britain and France, and right into the jaws of defeat. He remembered how Bruno's army had swept through the Alps like wind through reeds, Milan taken without a shot fired, forcing a surrender on his own terms, when the order had already been given, not to advance further beyond the borders. The excuse he had given at the conference to sign the Treaty of Surrender was that his radio was malfunctioning in the Alps, and that he had only received the message after Milan was occupied. Knowing all of this, Emmanuel had long since gotten a good estimation of Bruno's character, and understood after calming himself that Bruno was extending him and Italy an olive branch to join the winning side of the next war to come. I would much prefer to be a friend than an enemy. And when Emmanuel said this, Bruno knew that the southern border would forever be secure. Bruno raised his glass. The future of Europe was becoming clearer by the day, one monarch at a time. Chapter 5:14, A Dinner That Changed the World. Bruno had laid the trap perfectly, and the Italian king, desperate for stability in a time where his country was beginning to feel left to the wayside, he was all too quick to jump into it. And now that Bruno had the man exactly where he wanted him, he closed the trap shut and sealed the deal. What I'm proposing is to give Italy a place at the table. I understand your nation, like many others, is still recovering from the effects of the war. Luckily for you, the Italian front collapsed rather quickly, and you surrendered under ideal terms. Bruno raised his fork, chewing, enjoying the savory taste of its succulent meat, before continuing with his speech. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, I did in fact ignore commands and pursue control over northern Italy with a rapid assault just in time for the peace conference to begin. Do you think such a move was as ignoble as you have professed all these years? Emmanuel was about to protest, but Bruno raised his fork, chewing on the food in his mouth, washing it down with more beer before continuing. Please, let me finish. I promise there will be time to speak when I am done. The King of Italy refrained from interrupting, no matter how much he wanted to, then relaxed his posture, as Bruno began once more to speak his mind. If I had not seized Milan and the surrounding regions, do you think you would have surrendered so quickly? Or would you have rejected the Kaiser's offer and continued the war? How would Italy look now if my army humiliated you worse than we did to France? It took all of 3 seconds for Emmanuel to realize where Bruno was going with this, but he remained silent still, knowing that the man still had not finished his thought. You see, had you forced my hand, and I crushed your army all the way to Rome, razing your cities to the ground in the effort it would have taken me to do so, you would be overrun with Reds and reactionaries. In fact, your country would look a lot more like France right now. Having listened to Bruno's every thought, and himself having entertained it for more than a few moments of awkward silence, Emmanuel finally cleared his throat as he begged for clarification. Are you saying you ignored orders and marched to Milan for the sake of Italy and its people? Bruno remained quiet for a long time, letting this idea fester and stir in the mind of the Italian king before finally giving an answer. Hypothetically, had I disregarded the Kaiser's orders and marched on Milan, then it would have been for the sake of the men beneath my command. I would have been beside myself if their blood had been shed needlessly in battles that should not have been waged. The King of Italy was just about to burst forth from his seat, believing that Bruno was playing him for a fool, until Bruno began to speak once more, his voice more calming and soothing, at least at first. That being said, yes, you could say I did this, to end the war, and spare needless suffering for your people as well. Then Bruno's tone upticked as a sneer formed on his face. And of course, to teach Italy a valuable lesson, that you are not our equal. Your senseless pride made you unnecessary enemies of the Reich, and in doing so, forced me to fight a third front I would have rather avoided. Emmanuel had no idea whether he should be outraged, appalled, or awe-stricken with the way Bruno effortlessly played with his emotions, all leading towards a point he still could not surmise. That is until Bruno finally said it after enjoying the game long enough. This attitude of yours needed to be crushed in its entirety. That is before we could ever help you reach your true potential. I have 2 daughters that are yet betrothed. You see where I'm getting at here. The Italian king simply silently nodded, waiting to hear the fullest extent of Bruno's offer before deciding how best to act. I want you to marry one of the boys from the House of Savoy to my daughter Anna. He can be from either its main line, or a cadet branch for all I care. Bruno's eyes suddenly narrowed. His tone shifted to sharp and overbearing. But he mustn't be cruel, sadistic, or unpleasant. My daughters mean more to me than you could ever imagine, and if this boy mistreats her in any way, even long after they have come of age and married, I will personally hold your entire house responsible. The silence that followed Bruno's threat was deafening. Emmanuel was no fool. He knew of what happened in Belgrade and why it occurred. There were men in the world foolish enough to dare such a thing after what happened in 1914, and the King of Italy was not one of them. Rather, He was quick to ask a far more important question on his mind, trying to steer the conversation away from the dreadful turn it had taken. If I do this, what precisely do I get out of it? Bruno scoffed, eating further from his plate while shaking his head, almost as if he was dealing with a simpleton. Even so, he spelled it out plainly and clearly for his guest to properly understand. Peace, freedom, justice, security, and prosperity. Is that not what we all want for our families and our nations in this world? Did you not find it curious when I invited you to my home and forced you to walk along the streets I have built? This is the future of Europe, my friend, here and now in Tyrol. And Italy can either join it as a contributing member of the New World Order, or it can be burned to ash and forced to slave and toil for its masters once I have pressed my boot on the neck of Rome. The fate of your country is entirely yours to determine, and it is a single choice, here and now, that you must make as king. Bruno said nothing after this, instead focusing on enjoying his meal, while leaving the King of Italy to stew about what he had been offered. Chapter 5:15. Cursed with Success. The matter was settled, and the King of Italy was welcome to stay the weekend in Tyrol, to get a feel for the world Bruno intended to create. Meanwhile, Bruno returned to his palace, his home. By now, after 8 years of dedicated construction and all the money and labor Bruno could pour into it, his family's future home was nearly complete. At most, 10% of it was still under construction. The estate grounds served as an operational fortress, symbolic as a capital, luxurious as a home, functional as a seat of government, yet were still growing in the depths and fringes, just as Bruno's empire is. It was a residence built to survive the end of the world if need be, and its ongoing construction was dedicated primarily to those purposes. Even so, that didn't stop him and his family from enjoying its vast grounds and the amenities within them. Bruno himself found his wife waiting at the door, with a liter of beer in hand, as she hugged and kissed her husband, all while whispering into his ears. So, how did your meeting go? Bruno grabbed the beer out of Heidi's hands and sipped its foam while kissing the woman on the lips in a way that transferred it to her own face, forming a mustache out of suds as he responded to her greeting. Excellent. I've secured a proper husband for our daughter, Anna. When she comes of age in approximately 10 years, that is. Heidi wiped her lip by plucking Bruno's pocket square out of his coat and using it for its intended purpose. She then nifty made sure it was seated perfectly in its proper place before adding an additional pat to the man's chest. And I presume that means you gained Italy as an ally for the Reich? Bruno simply nodded, taking his wife's hand as he led her to a living area of the mighty palace that he had built for them and their dynasty. The two of them sat down together, lounging on a sofa, like a couple much younger than themselves, Heidi resting her legs on her husband's lap as she clung tightly around his neck. Of course, do I ever fail? Heidi could only laugh lightly and shake her head, thinking back on all that Bruno had endeavored to do in this life. Now that I think about it, I can't say I have ever seen you fail at anything you have set your mind to in this life. Even when you tried to protect me from those sisters of mine and their petty jealousy, you were so brazen, bold as you tossed my father's guard to the floor. Bruno smirked, feeling a sense of pride well in his chest as this ancient memory from their childhood flooded his mind for the first time in years. Yeah, I'm pretty amazing, aren't I? Heidi could only flick her husband between the eyes as she scolded him about this matter for the first time in their lives. Amazing? You bastard. I was scared to death that my father was going to have you drawn and quartered for that act. But somehow, you not only got off without even a slap on the wrist, you even got the old man to begin treating me better. His wife hated it, but he had a valid excuse. Something he desperately needed, but never had until you gave it to him. I think that's why he never came after you for smacking my sister. Bruno could tell that Heidi was beginning to remember past regrets she had suppressed for years. Her relationship with her father was a distant one, and she had never truly reconciled with him during his life. She had only learned of the truth behind his actions after the man had passed, much in the same way she had with her mother. Because of this, Bruno wiped a strand of Heidi's hair away from her face and leaned in with a kiss. After doing so, he whispered into the woman's ear a comment that couldn't help but make her recover from her glum state. Anything for m'lady. Heidi couldn't help but laugh at her husband's poor joke. It was so absurd, and in the worst timing possible, she had to mock the man for it. Shut up. Must you always do that? Bruno's gaze softened as he grabbed his wife by the chin and forced her to look into his eyes. His words, tender, soft, gentle. But of course, I hate to see you look so sad. It wounds me more than the bullet in my shoulder ever could. Heidi rolled her eyes and pouted. Bruno was being unfair to this remark, but he was also being dreadfully serious. Knowing the full weight of how he received such an injury, and what it meant to the man, there was nothing she could say to rebuke such a sweet and grim sentiment. And seeing that Bruno had ultimately achieved his goal of uplifting his wife's mood, before she spiraled into depression over matters she couldn't change, he grabbed her hand and stood up, hoisting her into his arms. Playfully tapping her nose with his index finger, he made another joke that thoroughly outraged her. You might be right. I don't think it's possible for me to fail in anything I aspire. It took all of 2 seconds for Heidi to realize the man was openly bragging about how he had succeeded in making her feel better. Because of this, she stood with a huff, turned on her heel with theatrical flair, and stormed off, pausing just long enough to peek back and make sure he was watching. God, I love that woman. It would be a long while before their daughter was old enough to marry her newly betrothed. But that didn't matter, because Bruno had another daughter whose wedding was just around the corner, and that was far more important to him right now than matters which would be settled in a decade's time. Chapter 516, A Crown of Thorns and Roses. It was 1924. In the city of Berlin, within the royal court chapel, the biggest event of the decade was taking place. 3 years passed since Elsa married her husband Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich. But as the years passed, and time with it, so too did Eva find herself on her wedding day. Despite being the oldest of Bruno and Heidi's offspring, she was ironically enough the one to marry last, at least among the 3 eldest siblings. Today, she was standing in front of the mirror, her makeup and hair being perfectly crafted and applied by the Reich's greatest artists. Heidi and Elsa stood by her side, each radiant as the morning dawn, but their dresses subdued and their styles modest as to not outshine the bride on her big day. For years, Eva had been waiting for this day, and now that it arrived, she could not stop her heart from beating too quickly. Elsa was unusually cheerful, or perhaps her time in the Tsar's winter palace as the wife of the heir to the throne of the Russian Empire had made her more open to her real personality. Either way, Elsa was quick to comfort her elder sister. Eva, I was just as worried as you were on my wedding day, but it really isn't something you should be so anxious about. You only get married once in this life. Enjoy yourself. You and Wilhelm are great together, no? There was no denying it. Since she was an adolescent, her father and Wilhelm's grandfather had been arranging semi-regular meetings. They got along swimmingly, but Eva knew more than her sister just what this union meant. She touched her heart and confessed her feelings to her mother and her sister in secrecy. I love him with all my heart, but I'm not sure I'm ready. Heidi frowned at her daughter. Eva, you're not getting cold feet, are you? This has been in the works for years, and you're not getting any younger. Eva shot her mother a nasty scowl, as if to silently scold the woman, who was now closing in on 42 years old, yet looked a decade younger. But instead, she sighed heavily and explained her situation properly. It's not that, Mother. I'm worried I'm not ready to play the role Father has given me. He expects me to help Wilhelm lead when the time comes for him to take the throne. But there's so much I haven't learned. Elsa rolled her eyes. Of course her sister was worrying about the political aspect of the marriage, and not her duty as a wife and mother first. A role Elsa had taken quite a liking to, as she herself had a child with Alexei in the years since their wedding, with another on the way. Eva, I have held my tongue for the better half of the 22 years I have known you. But no longer. You are just like Daddy, always plotting for the future and never living in the moment. Elsa's face had grown red with fury, perhaps for the first time in her life, as she continued raising her voice. Your husband-to-be is not even the crown prince yet. Before he ever gains the throne, his grandfather and his father have to pass first. You have plenty of years to think about such things and continue your lessons. Now is not the time for such nonsense. Heidi was trying her best to hold herself back from laughing as she realized how much Elsa's assessment of her older sister was correct. With a deep breath and a heavy sigh, Heidi hugged both her daughters tightly and gave them some proper motherly wisdom. Elsa's right, Eva. You share your father's relentless neuroticism. And it seems for the both of you, it always manifests itself at the worst possible moment. Don't think about politics today. Think about the life you are going to build together with Wilhelm. You damn fool. Eva couldn't help but break out into laughter as she realized how foolish she had been, something she shared with her mother and sister together. Bruno had gathered his daughter and began walking her down the aisle. For a man approaching 45, he continued to age with grace, just as his wife did. He and Elsa were locked arm in arm. And for the first time in a very long time, Bruno had broken out the dress blues. For everyday wear, he much preferred the practicality of his Feldgrau uniform. But on today's special occasion, he wore the old blue Waffenrock with the gilded epaulettes and all the medals he had earned from the Reich and its many domains for a lifetime of service. Whereas Eva looked as divine as her younger sister Elsa and her mother Heidi had at their own respective weddings. Bruno finally took the last step and handed the girl off to her groom, giving the young man a fearsome gaze, as if a silent remainder of the price he would pay should he ever cause the girl harm or grief. A gesture that did not go unnoticed by the Kaiser, who stood next to Bruno in the pews and whispered, "Was it really necessary to terrify the poor lad like that? You know he fawns over your little girl, right? Besides, if he ever were to try something uncouth, I would personally mount his bollocks to my fireplace." Bruno had to prevent himself from laughing as the ceremony began. And when it did, Tsar Nicholas II, who was also nearby, leaned in and joined the conversation between Europe's most powerful figures. "I must say, Wilhelm, did you invite our cousin? Or did he show himself in? He wasn't present in St. Petersburg for my son's wedding." Wilhelm cast a gaze over at King George V, who had found his way to Berlin for this occasion. The man was silent, haggard, and weary, seemingly aged 2 decades in the 9 years it had been since the Great War came to an end. His own family stood by his side, but their gazes were not in reverence or awe at the majesty and grandeur put on for this mythic event. No, they were filled with deep concern. The changes in Berlin, which in many ways mirrored those in Innsbruck and other major German cities, were indeed a cause of concern for those who had been on the losing side of the Great War. And the Russo-German alliance was the blast furnace, forging a railway towards a new horizon. While the rest of the world was still doing its best to catch up to the generation of technology the Germans had wielded in the previous war. To say that this wedding was a showcase of how grand Germany had become was an understatement. And as the bride and groom kissed at the altar, Wilhelm sighed, while choosing to be totally honest for once. "I wanted him to see what he missed out on when he refused my offer. Had he accepted, we may have made our grandmother's dream a reality. But now I fear the British Empire will soon be coming to an end." A pause, and a long contemplation followed by a harrowed tone. "And whatever replaces it will be a shadow of its former grandeur," Bruno interjected, while clapping along with the rest of the audience. It was inevitable. They made their choice, and unfortunately for them, it was on the wrong side of history. Our job now is to ensure that destiny stays its current course, and that the Sisters of the Fate do not interfere with the world which we created, and that our children will cement. There was no disagreement among the 3 monarchs, only silent for what could have been, but what would never be. King George V walked out of the chapel with a haunted visage. He had seen the mistakes that Parliament had made clearer than ever before. And now, as Britain was still recovering from the wildfires that had taken half a decade to put out across its empire, he had come to also realize just how far Germany had shot ahead of his own realm. Britain, which had once been supreme among the great powers, was not a minor player in the concert that Germany was conducting. Sitting in the back of his limousine, he could not help but sigh in deep contemplation. No matter how much the trade between our 2 nations has benefited us, it won't be enough. If another great war is to follow our defeat, we will certainly lose again. Another figure sat across from King George in the cab of the limousine, but it was not a member of his family. Rather, when the man took of his fedora cap to reveal his haggard appearance, it was Calvin Coolidge, a man who this year would be running against the current president of the United States. His face was cold and calculating as he expressed a slight hiss before speaking. "That is why it is paramount I gain your support in the upcoming primary. I have reason to suspect President Hughes is compromised, and that he is a puppet of that Tyrolean devil you Europeans call a prince. Support me, and I will ensure you have the full industrial backing of the United States, should another war break out." There was a long pause, and only the two men in the back of the car would ever know what agreement had been brokered between them, or lack thereof. Chapter 517, Diplomatic Immunity. It was not long after Eva's wedding that Bruno found himself face to face with the President of the United States. Hughes, once confident in his position, now faced a serious primary challenger gaining traction across the country. The president was, naturally, upset. After all, he'd only won the 1920 election with Bruno's help. Now, as he called on the man once again, things had backfired in ways he hadn't expected. So, for the third time, Bruno crossed the Atlantic. He stepped into the Oval Office, inspecting its polish with an intense, clinical gaze. "Nothing really changes around here, does it?" he said, breaking the silence. "You're seeking re-election for a third term, breaking tradition, and yet your office looks exactly the same as my last visit. Have you considered adding some new decor? Maybe a trinket from your most recent diplomatic visit to a neighboring country? If you desire, I could even fetch you a machine gun to mount on your wall. Just a thought." If the president's expression was anything to go by, he was not the least bit amused by Bruno's attempt at small talk, and his words echoed that sentiment perfectly. "That's not why I invited you across the Atlantic. Can we please focus on the task at hand?" Bruno said nothing, at first. His face was still and cold. When he finally spoke, his words broke the silence like a firecracker. "I hate to break it to you, but the Democrats are probably going to win this time, even if you hold on to your incumbency." President Hughes slammed his hands on the desk and jabbed a finger in Bruno's face. A particularly outrageous gesture. "You promised me you'd solve this problem, but you've only made it worse. Those German gangsters you armed have firepower on par with the military. The bloodshed is out of control, and now you're telling me my opposition is guaranteed to win? You failed to hold up your end of the bargain." Bruno didn't rise to meet Hughes where he stood. Instead, he gave the man a cold, unreadable glare and gestured toward the chair the president had just sprung out of. "President Hughes, take a seat." Hughes hesitated, just long enough to realize it wasn't a suggestion. Bruno didn't need to raise his voice. His tone carried the weight of a firing squad. Grudgingly, the president sat. Bruno pulled a flask from his coat, took a measured sip, then stashed it away before continuing. "You asked me to solve your organized crime problem, and I delivered. You never specified that I do it in a way that helped your approval ratings. You implied it, sure, but it wasn't in the fine print. That's on you, not me." Hughes clenched his fists. His face flushed, ready to rise again. But Bruno's gaze stopped him cold. It wasn't the look of a politician. It was the glare of a man who'd ordered others to die and watched them obey. As for the Democrats winning, well, I'm afraid that's just the nature of democracy. Bruno leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. He gestured vaguely toward the American flag behind Hughes. "I believe I've made my opinions on the common man quite clear. Now, perhaps, you're beginning to understand. Most people have short attention spans. They care more about whatever drama the media conjures than they do about truth or stability." Hughes muttered, "You sound like you hate them." Bruno didn't smile. "On the contrary, I don't hate the common man. In fact, I have a great deal of respect for him. I simply don't trust his judgment when it comes to governing a state or ensuring its long-term survival." He stood and slowly approached the window. Rain tapped gently against the glass. He didn't look back. "Your people have rested on the laurels of neutrality for over 2 decades. You've prospered, with a few minor setbacks, while we in Europe bled for what we earned." Bruno paused for a moment, before looking back at Hughes. When he spoke again, the words hit just as hard. "I'm not judging you for staying out of foreign wars. If I were in your shoes, or those of your predecessors, I'd likely have done the same. And if I'm being honest, I may have had a hand in influencing that outcome." Hughes said nothing, but his eyes gave him away. He had suspected this truth for some time. Still, he knew Bruno had a greater point to make, and waited. "And what did your people do with that security and prosperity?" "They conjured an imaginary crisis, prohibition. In fighting a phantom threat, they created a very real one. Now that chaos needs solving, and even though it is being solved, it doesn't matter. The public doesn't care. The damage is already done, to you, and to your party. The Democrats will win, not because they're competent, but because they aren't you. In a two-party system, opposition is all that matters." Bruno turned back at last. "And in a system like that, where representatives are chosen through universal suffrage. Everyone loses equally. Hughes sat in silence. The room felt colder, smaller, and for the first time in months, the President of the United States had nothing to say. Bruno didn't allow the room to fester in silence. He stood up and began to head for the door. In doing so, he caught his host's attention. Hughes finally found his voice. "And where, pray tell, do you think you're off to?" Contrary to what President Hughes was expecting, Bruno turned to look at him just before leaving the Oval Office, an almost friendly look on his face and a matching tone, as he said the words the man had never thought he would hear again. "Well, Mr. President, if you must know, I'm going to go fulfill my promise and solve this little gangster problem of yours once and for all." He paused at the door, just long enough for the room to feel too quiet again. "Oh, and just as a reminder, my diplomatic immunity is still intact until I leave these shores." And then Bruno left, leaving President Hughes to laugh, as he cracked open a bottle of his finest Kentucky bourbon and drank straight from its lip. Bruno's car rolled up in front of a discreet building operating as a cat house. He'd flown from D.C. to New York, now dressed in a charcoal gray trench coat over a midnight blue three-piece suit. A matching fedora sat atop his head. He and his bodyguards approached the entrance. A thick-chested bouncer moved to block him, shoving a hand against Bruno's chest. "Beat it, old man. This party's invitation only, you understand?" Bruno's bodyguards, who accompanied him at all times, moved subtly, reaching into their coats for the weapons that lie beneath. But Bruno waved them down with a flick of his fingers. "This is all a simple misunderstanding. I want to speak to your boss. Mr. Fritz, right? I'm a friend of his, from back in Berlin. Tell him a ring brother has come to pay his respects." He removed one black leather glove and showed the signet ring, the symbol of their old brotherhood. The bouncer's expression changed instantly, eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, you should have told us you were coming. Please, right this way. You and your brothers are most welcome here." Inside, Bruno was led through the smoky, perfumed haze of the bordello. Working girls flocked toward the newcomers, their intent obvious. One purred up to Bruno. I've never seen men like you here before. I know you boys aren't from around here. Few men as handsome as you walk into my arms, darling. How would you like to go upstairs and get a room together, just you and I? Or perhaps your friends can join us for a discount." Bruno brushed her aside with a look of total disdain. He cared little for vice, especially in its most sinful forms. Prostitution was a disgusting profession to him, and he had no time nor care to dignify such a proposition with a response. The woman may have recoiled in her own sense of dismay as Bruno forced his way past her, but Bruno's attention was centered to the back of the room, where a group of men sat drinking whiskey, smoking cigars, and watching a strip show. Their suits were fine, but their German was broken, low class, and poorly spoken. When they saw the three strangers enter, they scowled and began to rise. But the bouncer intervened. "Mr. Fritz, pardon the intrusion, but these men say they're ring brothers from the fatherland. They've come a long way to see you." Bruno's face remained unchanged, but his icy blue eyes and the subtle fencing scar on his cheek said everything. He might not have worn a uniform, but Mr. Fritz recognized him. The cigar fell from his mouth, the cards from his hands. "Boys, leave us alone for a minute." His men hesitated. "Now? God damn it." The thugs grumbled but obeyed, pulling the girls away and leaving the lounge empty save for the two men and Bruno's guards. Bruno sat down, taking his fedora off his head and placing it on the poker table before he crushed the burning cigar in the ashtray and looked Fritz in the eyes. "Mr. Fritz, is it? I don't believe we've spoken directly before, but you know who I am, yes?" The silence said everything. Chapter 518, Legacy Denied. The New York mob boss, known simply as Mr. Fritz, instantly recognized Bruno the moment the man sat across from him. To say he damn near soiled himself upon contact was not an understatement. His eyes betrayed the fear he felt crawling up into his throat, suffocating him as he struggled to breathe. Bruno, however, was cold, indifferent. He knew exactly what he had done to this man back in Germany, and those like him, and his gesture of looking around the room betrayed this very sentiment. "Your kind never really changed, do you? I mean, you were one of the lucky ones. The others, like those who I snatched this ring from, well, they're either serving multiple life sentences, or are resting peacefully in our graveyards, are they not? Yet here you are, same shit, different dump. Despicable. Bruno removed his glove and displayed the ring. Not his own, a trophy. One taken from the man Mr. Fritz had once bowed to back in Berlin. The Feldgendarmerie had removed it and the finger in a brutal arrest. Whether it was police brutality or just a mishap during the takedown was irrelevant. It simply did not matter to Bruno. But to Mr. Fritz, he was looking at a relic that belonged to a ghost, one he was close friends with, and one whose execution prompted him to cross the Atlantic. When he received those submachine guns from the fatherland, he had never thought once that he was buying straight from the man who had destroyed his home, his life. He could only sit there silently, knowing that the man in front of him was truly untouchable. In fact, he suspected Bruno was actually here to put a bullet in his brain. But instead, Bruno motioned towards one of the girls tending the bar. Be a doll, and fetch me and my ring brother here 2 fingers. Will you, sweetheart? Despite looking down on this entire establishment and everyone inside of it, Bruno still played the role he was given, and because of this, his speech did not reflect his true emotions. Rather, his facade was masterfully crafted, his dialect, pure New York, as he spoke in a way that amazed even Mr. Fritz. After receiving their drinks, Fritz sent the bartender on her way as well. Dorothy, go look after the others, will you? I'll handle the rest. The bartender didn't seem to notice the anxiety in her employer's eyes and was quick to do as she was told. And as she walked away, Fritz couldn't help but sigh and shake his head as he let what the thought would be his last thoughts escape his mouth. I'm going to miss looking at that ass. Bruno scoffed as he heard these words, drinking the entirety of his whiskey in one go. You think I'm here to kill you, and these are your last words? You're shit at dying, you know that. Fritz said nothing, wanted to let his statement stand for the record, and when Bruno reached into his jacket, he thought it was coming. Until, however, Bruno did not pull out a piece, but rather a photograph. The man's finger pointed at the portrait and then tapped it repeatedly. You have expanded into Chicago, right? Bruno's question was shocking, as was the face on the pamphlet in front of him. But Mr. Fritz did not stutter as he spoke. Yeah, of course I do. Why? Do you want Capone dead? It was 1924, a year too early for a man like Al Capone to truly make his name known to the world. But Bruno? He remembered. And because of this, he wouldn't let the man carve his path to infamy. Your words, not mine. It was clear by the way Bruno was talking that this was not a rejection of the proposal, but rather a confirmation. And because of this, Mr. Fritz couldn't help but ask for more information regarding the task he was being given. I don't understand. You want this man retired, but not me? Have you had a change of heart related to our way of life? Bruno sighed and rolled his eyes before enlightening the man on the reality of his situation. What you do here across the Atlantic is little of my concern, but a friend of mine requested help to deal with your types. Now, this isn't the fatherland. Where weaponizing the military to deal with dissident and criminal elements is well within my powers, especially during a state of war. Bruno then leaned back in his seat, still staring down the mob boss as he continued with his words. No, the United States is not a civilized country. It is chaotic. And because of this, if you want to restore the illusion of security in an inherently unstable society, you have to make deals with the devil. You wonder why I gave you such overwhelming firepower? I want you to annihilate your rivals from coast to coast and consolidate power in America's criminal underworld. And then, be quiet. The civilians, they don't need to know you, or your little organization exists after there's nobody left to get in your way. Keep it clean and keep crime among yourselves. The only thing worse than organized crime is unorganized crime. So keep it organized, you understand? Mr. Fritz immediately understood what Bruno was saying. In the United States, there were too many protections for criminals. The government couldn't just weaponize the army and the police to exterminate mobsters. But they could unofficially consolidate the German mob as the only major player in the game and use them as a bludgeon against would-be criminals within the communities they operated in. And when Mr. Fritz realized this, he began to fear Bruno far more than he had moments before. He grabbed the photo and slid it out of Bruno's hands, taking a solid and long look at the target before lighting the pamphlet on fire with his cigar. All right, tell your friend he's got a deal. We'll take care of the competition, and from now on, we'll do it quietly. You have my word. Bruno did not wait for another word. He He stood up and grabbed his fedora, placing it on his head as he walked out of the bordello. The sooner he left such a place behind and had a hot shower, the sooner he would feel comfortable again. In doing so, Bruno and his bodyguards left Mr. Furtiz behind, who immediately sunk in his chair and covered his face with his own hat, almost as if he was trying to drown his voice with it. Jesus fucking Christ. That night, Bruno called the President of the United States from his hotel room. It took a while, as it was far later in the night than President Hughes was used to. But eventually Bruno heard the familiar voice answer the other end of the line, where he was quick to take control of the conversation. Mr. President, I am a man of my word. The last piece of the puzzle is set in motion. Your little problem will be dealt with in time. Be patient, and you will see results soon enough. As for the other matter, if I were you, I would consider this election an opportunity to reflect and perhaps even retire from politics altogether with pride. It has been a pleasure to work with you these last few years, and if you do surprise me this November, I look forward to extending further cooperation when you require it. Until then, have a good night. Bruno then hung up the phone and rested his head fully on the pillow below. He would sleep without the slightest trace of restlessness, despite knowing what was about to go down in Chicago. Word had come over the wire, and people were contacted. Capone was as good as dead, but neither he nor his gang, the Southside Outfit, were aware of it. Currently, Capone was number 2, the lieutenant to Johnny Torrio. But in reality, he was the one really running things behind the scenes, even if the papers didn't say his name quite yet. Still, on a night like this, there was only one place the man would be. He was at a local brothel visiting his favorite girl. She climbed on top of him, and as he smiled, distracted and unaware, she reached into her stocking and drove a knife into his throat. Al Capone died bleeding out like a stuck pig, naked and covered in his own blood. His expression was one of complete and total shock. Death had come for him in the most unexpected form. Killed by a prostitute who owed Fritz and his gang a lot of money. One of the most feared mob bosses in United States history, snuffed out before he ever had a chance to become truly memorable. And the worst part was, the papers wouldn't even cover the matter. Just another nameless corpse in the gutters of Chicago. Chapter 519, The Children of Empire. Al Capone was just the first of many names on a list, silently and covertly transferred to the German mob. The list? Names of major players in America's criminal underworld. Or at least the biggest names, which Bruno remembers hearing about in his past life. Anyone who threatened to disrupt the consolidation of illicit power within the United States was silently removed. No St. Valentine's Day massacre or other such gruesome headlines would hit the news again for quite some time. But even if these murders didn't reach the news or were printed for public consumption, they still happened, and the fate of the American criminal networks changed forever. After returning to Tyrol, Bruno washed his hands of the event. He never spoke of it again, nor continued to hold direct ties to the German mob across the Atlantic. Any further business that needed to be attended to between the two parties was done through a proxy. The only reason he had even shown his face in New York was to remind Mr. Fritz that he wasn't some new age aristocrat. He was scum of the earth, and just another boot in Bruno's service. Bruno was ultimately right. President Hughes lost the primary later that year, and Calvin Coolidge lost to his opponent in the Democratic Party. John W. Davis was sworn into office and became the new president of the United States, beginning in 1925. But it mattered little. Bruno had enough evidence to bring the entirety of the American federal government down if the dirt was leaked to the public. Who sat in the Oval Office actually mattered very little to him. But what Bruno was most surprised to see was that the wiretaps had not been removed after Hughes left the office. In fact, the new president seemed not remotely aware of them, as if Hughes had not even warned the man. Either way, German intelligence did not blindly believe the information gathered from these bugged calls. Rather, they treated it as suspect, only verified if other forms of intelligence corroborated what was said on the tape. Frankly speaking, none of this really mattered to Bruno, who, during this time of peace, found himself focusing more on his own family than matters that were being delegated to the proper departments. Irwin was a prime example of this, having dropped out of the military academy to pursue a life as a civilian. He had long since graduated from university and had taken over his father's conglomerates as the primary driving force of administrative control. And to Bruno's surprise, The corporations from all industries that were tied to his name and family's wealth never operated more efficiently. Erwin had inherited his father's work ethic, spending most days in the office, securing government contracts, and ensuring that revenue was built on long-term and stable growth. Even the banking institutions under Bruno's control were involved in this conglomerate, and under Erwin's reign of terror, they had more or less gained national status across the German Reich and its current/former colonies. To put it simply, it was a private institution under Bruno's family line that ensured the German Reich's economy was entirely free from international constraints and foreign interference. The old major banking families in Germany and Austria were gone, part of Bruno's purges, which Erich had committed during the backdrop of the Great War. Their wealth and assets had been rapidly and silently acquired by Bruno's group after their extermination. In addition to this, Erwin's mastery of business and finance made it so Germany's economy was in a robust state, one that was entirely self-sufficient. Even so, the man and his wife, Alya, had not yet moved away from the old family manor on the outskirts of Berlin. Hence why, when Erwin returned home from work and saw his 4 children rush towards him, he could not help but smile, feeling the burden of being worked to the bone cured in an instant. Erwin's oldest child, Erich, named after his late godfather, rushed over to his father. Now 8 years old, he was old enough to cause more trouble than either of his parents cared to admit. And yet the boy was very well behaved, with exceptional manners. "Welcome home, father. How was your day at work?" Erwin, having smelled the food in the oven that his wife was cooking, found his mind distracted by other matters as he rustled his son's gilded hair. "Good enough, but better now that I'm home. Did you finish your chores yet? Because if not, you know your mother is not going to be pleased if she finds you here avoiding your responsibilities." Erich's face immediately flushed red. Apparently, he was not as well behaved as previously explained. And because of this, Erwin chuckled, noticing the guilt as he leaned down and looked his son in the eyes with a wide smile on his face. "Better get to it before your mother finds out." Just when Erich was about to run off, Alya's voice came from the kitchen, which was not far away. "I heard that." Erwin looked at his son. Both of them had terrified expressions on their faces before the two of them ran off, almost as if they were trying to escape the wrath and fury of a housewife scorned. Ultimately, there was no punishment that was given, as the family gathered around the table, ate a nice home-cooked meal, and spoke about what they had done during the day before retiring into the evening room to watch some television together. A device that was only available to households in the German Reich and the Russian Empire as a result of the brilliant minds working for those two nations and their collaborative efforts. It had been a year since Eva got married, and she was now not only the wife of the future Kaiser, but the mother of their first child. A young baby boy lies sleeping in the woman's arms, as she fawned over her offspring with maternal love and instinct, singing a song that her own mother had sung to her as an infant. All the fears she had on her wedding night had vanished the moment she and Wilhelm had tied the knot. And now, Eva was balancing the role of a wife, a mother, and a future Kaiserin, advising her husband on matters of politics and diplomacy at breakfast, while caring for the children throughout the day, and comforting him in the evening after coming home from his obligations as a man. Eva had taken naturally to her role, almost as if her parents had groomed her for it her entire life. And as she lay the young infant boy back into his crib, tucking him in gently, and ensuring he was comfortable, she whispered something that only she could hear. "Sleep well, Bruno, my son. For one day you will be accomplished great things, just like your grandfather." After saying this, Eva left the child's bedroom and shut off the lights, ensuring that the music box on the nightstand near the cradle played a gentle and soothing tune. Elsa was a different form of a queen than her older sister. She cared little for politics, diplomacy, or other matters of the state. She did not advise Alexei about how to perform his role. No, Elsa lived a life as a wife and mother first, and a Tsarina second. By now, she had a litter of her own children with Alexei, each of which was very dear to her and the rest of their family. Whether it was Alexei's parents and sisters, of Elsa's siblings, and her own parents. These children born in St. Petersburg were doted on by all parties. In fact, one might say that was just how Bruno was towards his family in general. But Elsa was very much so personally involved in her children's lives in a way that was unusual for many aristocratic or noble mothers. And she was also very much involved with her husband's life. Whether it was making sure he had his clothes for the day properly set out for him in the morning before either of them left their room, something that was often left to maids in other noble marriages, or on occasion cooking something herself, and giving the kitchen staff a day off. It was a unique experience for Alexei to come to the woman who played the role of the palace's caretaker, rather than a woman like Eva, who was following her father's example. And on days like today, that Elsa finally had some time to herself, she painted. And what did she paint today? Gone were the paintings that expressed the pain, grief, and sorrow of an entire generation of men. No, today, she was painting something far more heartwarming. It was the scene of her and Alexei, both embarrassed teenagers, meeting for the first time, in love, but having no idea how to express it. And after applying the last dab of paint to her latest masterpiece, Elsa gazed at its beauty and nodded with a smile on her face, her words escaping her lips. "I hope Daddy likes his birthday present." Chapter 520, U900. By 1928, the world hadn't caught up, nor would it, not in time. But deep within the shipyards of Danzig, Germany unveiled a weapon that made the Great War look like a schoolyard scuffle. Nearly 3 more years had passed since 1925, and something truly spectacular was emerging within the German Reich. Over the 12 years since the end of the Great War in this alternate timeline, the fatherland had become almost mythic. There were rumors abroad of a modern-day Atlantis rising in Europe, a land of impossible advances, secret technologies, and prosperity so profound it bordered on the unreal. Yet within the borders of Germany, it was simply the result of meticulous planning, limitless ambition, and the guiding hand of Bruno von Zehntner. The infrastructure was unlike anything else on Earth. Mega highways crisscrossed the empire, high-speed rail lines connected to capitals and towns alike, harbors teemed with new generation vessels, and sprawling airfields dotted the countryside. Power sources, once thought theoretical, nuclear, hydrogen, and advanced thermoplastics, had become realities. And while these advancements dazzled the public and terrified rival powers, the true marvels of German innovation remained hidden behind locked doors and iron curtains. Military projects were a matter of sacred secrecy. Every facility was guarded by elite units, and every scientist monitored by the twin eyes of German and Russian intelligence. Since the dynastic alliance formed between the betrothal of Bruno's daughter Elsa and Alexei of the Russian Empire in 1917, a powerful research axis had been established. This joint German-Russian development framework allowed every field of science to accelerate well beyond its natural course. It was not mere progress. It was a controlled detonation of advancement. And today, Bruno had been summoned to witness its most silent detonation yet. Nearly 15 years had passed since the first Type XXI submarines were rolled out for the Kaiserlich Marine. Even by 1928 standards, the design remained cutting edge. But with Bruno's foresight and obsessive adherence to long-term retrofitting, these submarines were far from obsolete. With routine overhauls, replacements of outdated systems, and structural upgrades, the oldest hulls, now 16 years in age, had their lifespans projected to stretch well into the mid-1940s, possibly beyond. Those that had aged out of frontline service were repurposed, some as training vessels, others as test beds for primitive unmanned underwater vehicle (UUV) concepts. Submarine warfare, as the world understood it, was still in its infancy. But Bruno had already forged its adulthood. These retrofitted Type XXI submarines received a suite of upgrades. Reinforced pressure hulls constructed from composite laminated alloys. Advanced hydrodynamic shaping informed by Type XXVI and XXI hybrid research. Overhauled propulsion systems, swapping early electric motors for efficient diesel-electric or Walther turbine variants. Upgraded digital fire control systems and acoustic homing torpedoes. Pop-up rocket launchers embedded into the deck for land attack or anti-ship missions. Despite these innovations, they were still merely the shadows cast by a newer titan. Today marked the unveiling of a vessel so far beyond the old doctrines that it belonged more to tomorrow than to 1928. Her hull was a culmination of Type XXVI stealth contours, Type XXI modularity, and Cold War-era fluid dynamics that Bruno alone understood. For all intents and purposes, this was the spirit child of the never-built Type 6, a ghost sub resurrected with flesh. This was U-900. Her design featured a streamlined teardrop hull, optimized for permanent submersion. Equipped with early AIP and Walther turbines, she could remain submerged for weeks. Her sonar profile was nearly non-existent to all but Germany and its Russian allies. On her dorsal line, sealed within retractable hatches, sat a bank of VLS-style pop-up rocket pods, capable of launching early cruise missiles or precision torpedoes from below the surface. And this was just the hunter-killer variant. A larger sister class, currently in late development, would soon follow. These Raketenboots, as some were already calling them, were ballistic missile submarines designed to strike coastal cities from submerged positions, with a range nearing 20 kilometers. Still undergoing stress testing, they represented Bruno's ultimate play for submerged deterrence. Bruno stood at the edge of the dry dock, his long coat billowing in the salty air as he looked upon the future made manifest. The submarine gleamed under the overhead lights, sleek, predatory, and quiet as death. This was more than a machine. It was a philosophy, a doctrine of silence and supremacy. Around him stood Germany's grand admirals, their expressions mixtures of reverence and disbelief. Some had dismissed Bruno's ideas a decade ago, called them fantasy, wasteful, even mad. Now they stood before a ghost ship brought to life, and could only marvel. Bruno descended the catwalk and entered the U-900 for a final walkthrough. He took his time. Every console, every hydraulic seal, every launch tube. Nothing was out of place. The reactor housing, silent and unassuming, throbbed with contained energy. The crew quarters were cramped but livable. The sonar suite, a generation ahead of anything Britain, France, or America even had on their drawing boards. He stopped at the command chair, placed his hand on the armrest, and looked around. This was the edge of tomorrow. Turning to the assembled officers, his voice rang clear and low. Gentlemen, the next Great War is already over. In contrast to Germany's ongoing advancements in warfare and their technological union with the Russian Empire, Great Britain had an ongoing offer on the table from across the Atlantic. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge, presidential nominee for the Republican Party, had approached King George V with an offer to join the United States in a military and economic alliance. One with a silent clause of technological joint development in certain critical fields. At the time, King George had laughed at the offer and sent Calvin Coolidge home with nothing to show for his journey to the British Isles. And in the end, Calvin Coolidge had lost to the Democratic nominee like Bruno had expected. However, the people soon realized that Democrats didn't really have an answer to the problems that had been created as a result of a lack of others to solve. And thus, in 1928, Herbert Hoover was starting to look like he was going to come out on top in this upcoming election. As a result, the Republican Party sent another envoy to Great Britain in an attempt to speak with the king and further negotiations. As a result, an aide of the presidential nominee sat in Buckingham Palace, with a cup of tea in his hands, across from the aging king, who looked upon the man as if he were a nuisance. I'll have you know, the only reason I'm entertaining this meeting is because recent reports from Germany have been troubling. If the stories are to believe, they are practically a modern-day Atlantis, and since we are already on their bad side after the Great War, I am just willing enough to listen to what you have to say. It had taken some time, but seeing Great Britain fail to keep up with even the technology the Germans had used in the previous war in certain regards, or just barely catching up with others. Even the ever-proud British Empire had been forced to admit they were falling behind. Not that the aide really cared. Instead, he spoke with determination and confidence as he tried to sell his pitch to the British monarch. Allow me to be blunt then. The reason Germany and Russia have advanced so quickly is because they have combined their resources, manpower, and think tanks to outpace the rest of us. I suggest we do the same, through a less formal and permanent alliance than what they have going on. An alliance built upon mutual interest, not something as antiquated as dynastic marriage. Surely you agree. Americans were quite an arrogant people, so much so they might actually give the British a run for their money. They believed their lifestyles, their ideals, their norms, were the way the entire world worked. and could not even fathom someone else, especially a king of an ancient household, holding some favoritism towards something like alliances cemented in stone through dynastic marriages, rather than tied to mutual interest that died when the next administration was voted into power 8 years later. Even so, King George and the British Empire as a whole were becoming quite desperate, as they were technologically outpaced by their adversaries at every level. And thus, he let this snide remark slide, instead, letting his thoughts on the matter be known with a forcefully calm facade. 4 years ago, when your forbearer approached me with this proposition, I shut him down. And yet you come to me offering the same thing? For the same reasons, no less. Yet you think I will so quickly accept them and be thankful for it. The aide had no idea what to say in response. He was absolutely dumbstruck, and was just about to leave with his head helm in shame and embarrassment. That is until King George muttered beneath his breath, "And you would be right." Chapter 521, Focke-Wulf PTL. The aide sent by the Hoover campaign to the British Empire damn near choked on his tea when he heard the response from King George V. He expected a more hardline stance and the need to negotiate further, while the American had presented a strong argument for the need for cooperation between the two powers. The reality was that the United States was sorely behind in tank and aircraft technology than their European counterparts. They had not really witnessed the effectiveness of tanks on the modern battlefield during the Great War, nor did they have access to much in terms of principles to go off of when it came to what worked and what did not. As a result, the American military's technological progression was almost entirely unaffected by the Bruno's interference in the timeline. In 1928, the USA was still fielding M1918 Ford 3-ton tanks and Curtiss P-1 Hawks. Even in Bruno's past life, these were less than ideal weapons for a battlefield in the current era, let alone a potential competitor against what Germany was currently fielding and developing. There was limited knowledge and expertise regarding the development of these weapons platforms in the United States, and many of its best minds suited to the task had been poached by Germany and Russia already. What the USA offered was less research and development and more manufacturing capability. Even so, either King George didn't know this, or was desperate at this point for some kind of breakthrough. Thus, when the British monarch spoke again, he did so with severity in his tone. "I am willing to sign a contract that allows for the joint research and development of technology in critical fields with the United States for the next 4 years, and is capable of being extended every 4 years after the fact. Tell your employer that when he sits in the Oval Office, he can reach out to me at any time with a draft of the terms, and I will review them. If I find them to be appropriate, I will have no qualms about signing the agreement. I look forward to hearing from you and Mr. Hoover in the near future." Not another word was said as the aide shook King George's hand and fled back to the United States to personally deliver the good news. In some distant part of Russia, far beyond the eyes and ears of spies and observers, lie a barren airfield. Despite the fact that there were currently no planes but one on the runway, the airfield itself was heavily fortified. Anti-aircraft guns as far as the eyes could see, and reinforced concrete fortifications with the men to man them lie as far as I could see. Why was this the case? Because the restricted airspace above existed to maintain privacy and secrecy for the aircraft that were designed to be tested in the worst conditions possible. It was the summer of 1928, and after over a decade of research, development, prototyping, and testing, the first turboprop engine was already approved for mass manufacture, and had begun doing so within the aviation factories of the German Reich and the Russian Empire. But just because turboprop engines designed for fighter aircraft were already production as far back as 1924, did not mean that the fighters themselves had been perfected. But today, the dream was finally upon those who had strived so hard for its creation. The Focke-Wulf PTL from Bruno's past life served as a large inspiration for the fighter aircraft itself. Modified slightly in some ways or another, the aircraft was quite honestly brilliant when it was put to paper in its original timeline. Let alone, now, as for the turboprop engine, it was based upon designs like the Jumo 004, He 011, and modern turbine principles. At the same time, it borrowed heavily from improvements that increased the efficiency piston prop engines like that of the Packard V1650, and applied them where they could utilize. The result was a 3,000-shop turboprop engine driving 6 contra-rotating propellers, resulting in a top speed of 460 miles per hour and a ceiling of 30,000 plus feet. Meanwhile, its maximum range on paper was 2,500 miles with a full weapon loadout. Currently, a German test pilot, in full uniform, with his distinctive Luftstreitkräfte leather aviator's jacket, stepped into the semi-pressurized cockpit, where he then buckled his seat and began performing basic checks on the plane. The voice on the radio was quick to check in with the pilot, who picked up his receiver and spoke his response. "All systems are a go. I am preparing for takeoff." The man ignited the engine, which roared to life, and in doing so, caused all who witnessed its glory to hold their breath in silence. And then, after receiving clearance for takeoff, the man steered the plane down the runway, into the proper position to begin the first attempt at fighting for a new generation of aircraft. And then, the plane began to run, sprint, and eventually climb into the sky, where it took off, followed by safety chase aircraft which had been on standby in the event of catastrophe. But it flew smoothly. The first flight was brief, a loop around the airfield, and then back again. It was testing for function, vibration, and safety first. And when it landed, the airfield broke out into cheers, because they had crossed the hurdle into true functionality without a disaster on their hands. As for the rest of the testing, it would be at least another 2 years before the German Reich and the Russian Empire had approved the aircraft for total adoption. But by 1930, the Focke-Wulf PTL would begin seeing service, and by then a surplus of engines would be in storage to facilitate their manufacture. As for Bruno, who stood by the Kaiser and Tsar's sides, with a smirk on his face, he turned around and made a bold proclamation to them both. "From this day forth, we own both the seas and the skies." Chapter 522. First Strike. For years, the Empire of Japan had been eyeing German territorial possessions in the South Pacific, particularly in the region of New Guinea and Micronesia. Bruno had been sent before to Tokyo to discuss these matters with Emperor Taisho, and the result was his permanent exile from the nation. Since then, a matter of trade disputes, border conflicts, and open diplomatic hostility had compounded for the need to transfer equipment and personnel to the region. And Bruno, sensing that a small-scale war would be breaking out soon with the Empire of Japan, forced the man to act. As the Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces and its supreme commander outside of the Kaiser himself, Bruno had taken the chance to deploy several of the older naval units to the region, as well as the ground and air attachés with them. The reason for this was simple. He did not want the world to truly understand the length that the German Reich and their Russian allies had developed to at this point. Over the course of the remainder of 1928, German units, armed with the fully realized E-Series combined arms battalions, were transferred to the region. Albeit, the primary tank deployed was the new E-10 OSV, which made use of a 7.5 centimeters PAC 39L/48, as well as a new suspension system. During the Great War, torsion bar suspensions had been used on E-Series armor due to the technology being easy to implement at scale. But over the course of the last decade, all new chassis had replaced the old torsion bar system with the conical spring Belleville washer system that the E-Series of armor was originally designed for in Bruno's past life. This new suspension system was simply bolted onto the chassis and could be easily removed for repair or replacement. They were also easier to manufacture and required less rare earth metals to make. In addition to this, it allowed the height to be lowered 176 centimeters to 140 centimeters. But these armored units were not the only forces deployed to the region. Naturally, aerial assets were shipped to replace the aging equipment used by colonial forces, including but not limited to Bf 109 fighters, Ju-217 medium bombers, and Ju-52 light transports. As for the Pacific Fleet, its older Great War-era vessels were largely replaced with the Type XXI submarines, manufactured in a later year and not yet retrofitted to modern standards. In addition to this, several cruisers based largely upon the Prinz Eugen-class heavy cruisers made their way to the region. Other ships included high-speed, diesel-electric, ocean-going destroyers as escorts. Either way, the German Eastern colonial forces had steadily, and covertly over the course of the last decade found their horrifically outdated equipment replaced with gear that Germany was now relegated to secondary forces, and yet were still cutting edge as far as the rest of the world was concerned. And nobody seemed to notice, most certainly of which were the Japanese, who had decided waiting for a peaceful solution to territory they laid claim to was no longer an option, thus making the bold, but strategically inept decision to launch an attack against a German naval base in German New Guinea in the morning on October 10, 1929. While Bruno slept peacefully in his home in Tyrol, he was awoken by a servant as he cuddled up next to his wife. "Sir, there is a call for you in your office. It has been ringing nonstop for 10 minutes. I tried to tell them you were sleeping, but the man on the other end says it's urgent." Bruno, normally a man liable to throttle anyone who dared wake him, knew that if someone was calling him at this ungodly hour of the day, they were either asking for a severe beating and maybe perhaps a hostile takeover, if he were in the proper mood, or it was a matter of supreme national security. And thus, when he heard that there was a phone call in his room, he snapped awake instantly, adrenaline surging in his veins as he climbed out of bed and got himself dressed appropriately. Heidi, having understood the weight of this phone call as well, was quick to fetch her robe and get to work. She knew her man would be up for many hours and would be in need of coffee, breakfast, and perhaps even moral support if the incident was severe enough to warrant a call at 3 in the morning. And when Bruno stepped into his office and picked up the line, he heard a single phrase from a familiar voice before the opposing party hung up entirely, cutting the call in the process. "We have been attacked. I need you in Berlin now." Bruno sighed heavily as he rubbed his temples in an attempt to soothe his oncoming headache. At the same time, Heidi handed him his coffee with a concerned look on her face. "How bad is it?" Bruno said very little, but it was enough for the woman to fully understand. "Best prepare that cup to go, love. I'm needed in Berlin." The woman simply sighed and rolled her eyes, walking away as she said the same exact words that her husband was thinking. "So it begins." Bruno didn't respond. He didn't need to. They had both seen this coming for years. Naturally, Heidi was aware of what had been ongoing in Asia and knew that if Bruno was being summoned to the Reich's capital, the Japanese had finally made their move. And if they had done so, it meant Bruno would be gone for a while, either deploying directly to the region or would be orchestrating the war from the safety of Berlin at the Kaiser's side. Either way, a war with Japan had broken out, and Bruno would wage it the same way he had endeavored to wage all wars in this life. And that was to fight until the very last. Japan had brought this upon themselves, and since they wanted it, he would give them more they could endure. And perhaps in doing so, break the might of the Empire of Japan before it could ever truly rise to the greatest heights it had received in his past life. Chapter 5:23, A Declaration of War. The attack came under cover of night. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trespassed into German colonial waters, but this time, they fired the first shot. This was no warning shot over the bow. This was a deliberate strike by multiple cruisers upon a lone German destroyer. Outnumbered and outgunned, the ship was sunk. Japan had been isolated during and after the Great War, due to their geographical location and the focus of the war being in Europe. They received little aid in their own ambitions, and won just fine all the same. It was this thinking that led them to believe, under the Taisho regime, that they were no longer behind the European powers, but were far ahead of them. A bold assumption, but a mistaken one. Japan's development cycle had been spurred by necessity in this timeline. It had been taught during the Great War, from observations made after it, that armor, aircraft, and highly mobile units with high-volume small arms were a must to secure victory in the next war. Because of this, they had invested significantly into the development of things like monoplanes, tanks, and semi-automatic rifles beginning as early as 1918. After over a decade of efforts, they had produced weapons that were at the very least functional in the field. But function alone did not win wars. Not against Germany. This resulted in the production of the Ki-27 a decade earlier in life than in the previous timeline Bruno had come from, as well as the Type 97 Chiha medium tank and the Type Ko rifle, which would have been impressive if it weren't for the fact that Germany was already fielding significantly better equipment even among their colonial troops. But none of this was Bruno's concern as he walked through the office of the German Reich's military high command. When he did so, his face was stern and enraged. He moved like a storm contained in human form, his mere presence scattering doubt from the room like leaves before the wind. Those who witnessed him would mention later in life that he looked like a man possessed, and they knew then and there that he wasn't going to simply defeat the Imperial Japanese Army. He was going to completely dismantle the Empire of Japan itself. Thus, when Bruno entered the room where the Kaiser and all his generals were gathered, the room, which had previously been bickering over how to proceed, was quick to enter total silence. Bruno took one look at the map on display and the pieces on the board and immediately understood the situation. Making a move to the naval assets, or the figures that represented them, he moved them into a position that nobody was expecting. Deploy the Pacific Fleet to the Bismarck Sea. Mine the straits. Use destroyers and U-boats to intercept enemy transports. Wolfpack Doctrine. Scramble all Bf 109s for air superiority. Do 217s are to conduct torpedo strikes and recon. Ju 52s remain on reserve for airborne deployment and supply runs. We will not accept their invitation to open sea combat. Drag them to our choke points. Then annihilate them. I want artillery on every shoreline and range. Once their landings fail, they'll panic and commit fully. That's when we break them. Get it done. Nobody dared disagree with Bruno's orders, and immediately did as he said. Meanwhile, the Kaiser pulled Bruno aside and was quick to give his own thoughts on the matter. Are you sure that this is the best strategy? The Empire of Japan has attacked us without provocation and without a declaration of war. Should we not muster the High Seas Fleet in retaliation? Bruno scoffed as he shook his head, drinking the cup of coffee, which was handed off to him by an aide, as he did so. They wanted this war. Let us oblige them. But we will not show our full hand. Colonial assets alone will suffice, and the world will learn that Germany, even at half strength, cannot be challenged. The Kaiser said no more. He trusted Bruno's judgment on military matters more than anyone. In Tokyo, the Japanese military leadership had gathered in the war room, the same way the Germans were in Berlin. The men were confident in a swift and brutal victory. And why wouldn't they be? Their investments had paid off. Their armed forces had some of the most advanced weapons in the world, and their training was of elite quality. But there was just one problem. When they attacked a German naval vessel culminating in a declaration of war by the German Reich, they did not expect just how far ahead Germany was over the rest of the world. But that was not a fact yet revealed to the Empire of Japan. Instead, they were already toasting to a victory which would give them another step towards total Pacific dominance. The clink of porcelain cups echoed like a funeral bell in waiting. Kenpai. The generals and admirals downed shots of sake, as they spoke boastfully of how they perceived the war to go. Utterly foolish. Our reconnaissance shows that earlier this year, the Germans withdrew their last battleship in the Pacific and had it scrapped for parts. It would seem they have lost any concept of naval projection. It was almost like they were asking us to come in and take their colonies. The man who said this was quite proud in his assortment, and it was a sentiment shared by all the others around him. As for a nearby general, he was quick to add his own thoughts. Once we have obliterated their petty fleet, we will send in the army to seize New Guinea and the surrounding islands. Nothing can stop us now. It was almost as if God was watching, and this life was little more than a divine comedy, because right on cue a runner brought in a message and handed it to the chief of staff waiting for his judgment, as the news he carried was far from good. But the chief of staff did or said nothing, at least not initially. Only his expression soured, and when he did finally speak, so too did his tone soften. The Russian Empire has declared war on us and invaded Korea. As silence fell over the room, the sake turned to ash in their mouths. Suddenly, the celebration had ended and instead turned into a moment of mourning. The Japanese had not anticipated the Germans calling upon the Russians for aid in a petty matter like a colonial conflict, nor had they expected the Russians to accept. Japan was no longer facing an enemy in the far western world. They were fighting a united Eurasian bloc, one that they shared a border with, and they only now realized how badly they had screwed up. They had not picked a fight with a weakened colonial power. They had provoked a Eurasian titan. Chapter 524. The Battle of the Buka Shore. Japanese pilots flew their Ki-27s towards the Bismarck Sea. They were hyper-focused, most likely stimulated on some form of pharmaceutical substance. Their eyes dilated and locked in. These men were confident, almost superhumanly so. The emperor had guaranteed them that the Japanese army was the greatest and most advanced in the world, and his word was divine truth. It didn't hurt that this was partially true. Outside of Germany and Russia, Japan did have weaponry that was a decade ahead of the competition. Meanwhile, their training was elite. Lessons learned from the Great War showed the importance of aviation on the modern battlefield. And as the wing of Ki-27s approached their target, they saw explosions erupting from below. But these explosions were not an uncontested domination of their naval landing forces. Rather, the opposite. The wing ahead of them was torn to shreds by flak. The airburst ammunition exploding once achieving critical proximity, tearing the fighters to shreds like paper planes, and felling the pilots with them. Meanwhile, coastal artillery batteries fired upon Japanese naval vessels such as landing craft and their destroyer escorts. The heavy, 17 centimeters and 21 centimeters artillery ravaged the ships in a way that had been entirely unexpected. Despite Bruno making a similar move at Port Arthur on behalf of the Imperial Japanese nearly 25 years prior. And yet, the Japanese pilots did not waver nor falter in their charge, shouting over the wire in unison as they ran straight through the kill zone over the island. Tenehika Banzai. And then they came, not from above, but from below, blending into the tropical brush which littered the hillsides. A squadron of Bf-109 sprinted into a climb at a rate that Japanese were not expecting. They fired from a seemingly disadvantaged angle, but their superior range turned that weakness into a deadly trap, shredding the enemy upon first contact, all while zipping by the surviving Ki-27s while still having yet to reach terminal velocity at a climb. The Imperial Japanese pilots were absolutely stunned by what they had witnessed. They had not managed to score a single kill in the initial pass, all while the German fighters circled around with superior turning radius, firing another barrage on the midsection of their fuselage as the Ki-27s still tried to turn their nose into firing position, igniting another half dozen of their fighters with their 20mm and 30mm guns and the airburst munitions within them. The development of advanced turboprop engines over the last 12 years had given the Germans a supreme advantage even in their current piston technology. These Bf-109s were no longer the planes Bruno once knew. They now roared with engines that rivaled the P-51 Mustang, leaving their enemies in the dust. In fact, this had become standard among fighter planes over the course of the last 6 years, including the colonial aerial attachés. The leader of the wing, which had been reduced by nearly a quarter of its size in 2 strafing runs upon making contact with the enemy, burst out into panic over his radio, connecting with high command. The enemy planes are too swift. They outpace us while climbing even when we are diving. Not to mention that. And then the channel went static as the wing commander's plane was shot out of the sky, not by an enemy pilot, but by a well-placed 37mm dual flak gun mounted on an E-25 Coelian turret from below. It had become a slaughter of the worst kind for the Imperial Japanese aerial forces, and the naval landing wasn't faring much better. Marching straight into tank traps which blocked the transfer of the Type 97 medium tanks, Japanese infantry were forced to advance on foot, straight into machine gun fire. The Germans had spent years providing coastal defenses and fortifications across their island territories, especially in the Pacific. The moment Japan revealed its hand as a potential adversary, they had made this preparation. While the ultimate objective was decolonization over the course of the next century in a way that built a stable foundation for the natives to operate as independent nations. The transition of power was designed to be peaceful, and this did not mean that the colonies were up for grabs by other imperial powers. Germany was now acting as the regents, reigning supreme over these regions until the local king came of proper age to govern themselves. And thus, it was their moral and legal obligation to protect these lands. And protect them they did, as the Japanese infantry found that marching against mounted machine guns contained within reinforced concrete bunker systems that were elevated above them for advantageous positioning, along with the men by their sides armed with assault rifles, was a death trap of the highest order. No matter how unyielding the spirit of the Imperial Japanese military was, its attempt to land on Buka Island was not only repelled, but utterly annihilated. Because one's will was secondary to the overwhelming might of the opposition they faced. And on this day, the Germans proved once again to have prepared for the next war, not by looking towards the past, but the future. And that mindset in a world that often did the opposite was truly visionary. By the time the sun rose over the reef, there were no survivors to surrender. Only blackened craters, shattered hulls, and driftwood bodies caught on rusted tank traps. Those who would observe the Battle of the Buka shore would learn a very valuable lesson: how not to approach an amphibious landing in the 20th century. As the entirety of the expeditionary force that Japan sent to the island while their main fleet was dispatched to engage, the Japanese in the Bismarck Sea were annihilated to the last man. While the German colonial forces had achieved significant tactical victory during the opening stages of the war, the Russians were likewise making vast gains in the Korean peninsula and the surrounding areas, seizing territories lost during the Russo-Japanese War, as well as marching past the borders of Japanese chosen with the intent of liberating Pyongyang on their march to the southern coasts. All across the Reich's eastern colonies, the message was clear: Bruno von Zehntner had prepared for this moment not in arrogance, but in prophecy. Chapter 5:25, The First Day of War. For over a decade, the Russian Empire and the German Reich had entered an alliance that opened up the board. One of the stipulations of this alliance was joint military command, procurement, and training, from as far west as German Burgundy to as far east as Russian Kamchatka. If there was a soldier raised, a weapon manufactured, or a bullet pressed, they would operate under the same specifications. To put it simply, the Russian army was as large, capable, and fearsome as the German army on their western border. And they were united with blood, faith, and dynastic ties. When the news entered St. Petersburg that the Empire of Japan had attacked German naval vessels in the South Pacific, and that Germany had responded through mobilization of its colonial forces, Tsar was quick to do the same, without even being asked by his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, to do so. Before Japan even realized what was happening, an army of 100,000 Russians was being mobilized at their shared border. With a sufficient ratio of aerial units and support, it took less than 3 hours for the Russian Bf-109s to obliterate Japanese fighters over the northern portion of Korean airspace. And when they did, thousands of Do-17 medium bombers began to launch a coordinated campaign of hell on Imperial Japanese ground forces in the vicinity. All the while, Russian self-propelled artillery based on the E-10 chassis, using a 10.5 cm quick-firing gun, as well as towed 15 cm, 17 cm, and 21 cm field artillery, rained absolute hell from the land. Before the Japanese army at the border of Korea even encountered a single Russian rifleman, they were shelled and bombed into oblivion. With the Russian combined arms, battalions began pushing forward without even making contact with the enemy. It was a disaster of epic proportions for the Japanese, who were already struggling with their losses at Buka during the onset of the war. Tsar Nicholas II was quite pleased with the results of the war so far. He feared initially perhaps that the Japanese, who had more advanced equipment than he was initially expecting, might put up a harder fight that could ultimately result in a stalemate. But as the initial push proved to be an overwhelming success, Russia had proven its dominance. It was not all that surprising that Russia now found itself for perhaps the first time in its history as a nation with actually competent military leadership. Problems that had riddled the Russian army for centuries, such as alcohol and drug abuse, had been banned while on duty and given strict penalties for those found breaking them. In addition to this, nepotism had been annihilated at every level. Meritocracy was the new norm, with the old aristocratic guard forcefully retired or outright purged, depending on their unwillingness to comply with the new order. At the same time, German staff officers, trained under Bruno's guidance, had enlightened the new generation of Russian generals and admirals towards the nuance and complexity of modern warfare. Future Russian and German officers studied the same curriculum and often exchanged with one another freely per semester at the academy. All of this had culminated into a Russian army that had fully realized its potential. The Tsar could not be more pleased as he congratulated the men across from him on their initial victory. with the Germans obliterating the Japanese division in Buka and our own forces crushing their border forces in Korea. I would like to make a toast to the effectiveness of this alliance and the gains it has already proven within just the first 24 hours of conflict. A great power has been crushed in the opening stages of its war with our alliance, and this is just the beginning. Together, Russia and Germany cannot be defeated, and it is thanks to all of your efforts. The Russian generals and admirals were quick to share their Tsar's toast. And while St. Petersburg was celebrating an exceptional start to the war, Tokyo was not so jovial with their current situation. While the emperor's body had long been frail, a cocktail of imported medicines synthesized by Japanese laboratories after observing foreign advancements had spared him from death in 1926. For years after, Taisho lingered like a shadow, delegating most imperial duties to his regent, but remaining the last check on the army's full ambitions. His survival delayed the inevitable, but not forever. The war was not started directly by Taisho. Rather, his council of sycophants had desired to push for it, now that he was bedridden, frail, and on his last limb of life. If he lived to see the end of the war, it would be painted as the final victory of the emperor. If he died beforehand, then victory would be accredited to his efforts. And while this line of thinking was solid, it was contingent on earning victory. However, now, things were not going as well as anyone had thought within the Japanese military and political leadership. Both opening battles had resulted in significant losses to their forces, and in doing so proved a wide gap in Japanese technology and doctrine when compared to their enemies. Japan had assumed, because their technology was significantly more advanced than what they observed being used by other nations, that it could contend with whatever Germany had fielded. But they never expected the Germans to still be years ahead of them. Nor did they expect Russia to immediately join the war. The worst part was, the emperor did not know that the war had even begun. Had he been informed, he might have suffered a heart attack from pure anger at what his ministers and generals had done without his knowledge or express permission. And if they told him now, he might have died of a heart attack from the pure grief of their failures. Their intentions didn't matter when the end result was that Japan had just received 2 enormous slaps to the face on the global stage, over a war they never should have started.